Diego? Diego? I'm not getting any sound.
Right. Raise this guy up a little bit. Right. Yeah.
Whereas this one, you say that it's verified. Jessica said she was going to say welcome. The question is,
That's it.
oh,
I'm just.
I'm Doug Husak.
Oh, hey, yes.
Right, are you around the next couple of days or not?
Tomorrow.
Good.
And then I leave Saturday.
Okay, good.
I was thinking somewhere else. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Great. Thank you much for.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Oh, it is. I had no idea.
No.
Yeah.
I just went outside.
So you'll be coming to dinner tonight, right?
I'm joining. I didn't know there was a dinner.
Yeah, there is a-
No, I'm gonna be joining Barry.
Okay.
Dinner.
Well, that's the same crowd.
Yeah, but we're going
Oh,
together.
okay. Well, if you have a Friday crowd, I could join you. I don't know.
Yeah, we
Something
do.
like that.
That's at my house, actually. That's,
We'd be announcing that at the event.
yes.
Okay, I'll just listen for
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Anybody see Jessica?
Oh, she'll show up soon enough. She's probably last minute panicking. She had a very long handout, so she may have panicked about that.
That's great. You're two or something.
Yep.
They say time flies.
Oh, there's Jessica.
Hey, Jessica, we're just waiting for you. Okay, great. So a couple of things. One is, I just want to express appreciation to everybody who's here. You know, I've learned a lot and it's been very good, both from my own talk and for interacting with other folks, and especially conversations with other people. So it's been great for me. It's not good. The other thing is there's a dinner that was organized to two conferences together. So I think you know there's a things connected free will and law conference that Doug Husak here is organized. And so he organized a dinner at a restaurant. And anybody here who's been a speaker, and anybody else I talked to, invite to it. It's welcome to come. You get it. And I can drive some people. And I just get an idea about who's going. And I will come. And Janan can come.
Yeah, this is a restaurant called Fresco. It's exactly 2 miles from here.
Okay, so I don't think I'll be able to drive as many people as might want to come. So
it's not
we have
the
to-
frog in.
It's not the Froggy and the
Okay.
PG. They thought it was too expensive.
Yeah, we have our own room. It's good. And I hope you'll come.
Raise your hand.
I never.
I think you can count bodies. I don't see anyone.
Okay, anyway, I can only,
So just
I can
count the
only
people.
take
Yes.
4 people. Other
that's
people will
what
have to
that
get
was
an
for.
Uber
I'm sorry.
to go, but anyway.
Yeah.
Does anyone here have a car?
Just so I have,
Oh,
Yeah.
2 people.
So
Plus
it's,
Barry.
as I say, 2 miles, and it would be great if some people could drive and then we need Uber.
I can drive. I just took over my oldest child's car and it's filthy. It's the first day, literally the first day I've driven it. And I got in it and so people who, who don't mind wallowing in filth.
So why don't we just say this?
Yeah.
After the whole thing's over, when's the dinner?
Maybe have some
She was at 6, right?
The dinner is at 6:30. We can get there early, but I hope we would meet in the lobby here at 6:15.
Okay, so if we meet at the lobby at 6 or 6:15 and then go over there. And I will take as many people as I can, other people can drive.
I can drive as well.
And I'm hoping to convince some people to go to jazz just around the corner afterwards. I saved some seats there.
Okay, so great. So 2 interesting talks. Finish this off. First is by Tim O'Connor. So I invited Tim because I wanted there to be something totally different from what everybody else, how everybody else here approaches stuff. Because he's not one of these, how should I describe it? Just physics mavens. Right?
More expansive view of reality.
But he does, and it is interesting. And I've been in debates with him. And definitely I've learned from him and they've been interesting. He didn't convince me, but as Peter Van Inwagen pointed out earlier, it never happens in philosophy. And then I learned about Tim, which I knew must be why I liked him. Is I'm now going to reveal something about me. I'm really being self-indulgent, but this is wiped out from this thing. That Tim is a great table tennis player. I mean, really, really good. I would have thought that about me too, if not now. But I was South Carolina state champion, and I think from what I'm talking to Tim, he probably would have beaten me at that time. But so he never played, and I don't know why when we engaged in the talking heads thing, but we didn't even talk about this because we could have played table tennis then. Well, I don't know why. No, but anyway, so I liked him. This must be the table tennis. Anyway, so he's had a very different approach to how to think about the issues of free will. And I guess it's totally connected to that.
All right. In light of Carlos' talk yesterday, some of you may decide after hearing me talk that I should have titled my talk Confessions of a Hidden Non-Naturalist. I'll say more about that in a bit. Jessica and I decided that we wanted to title this final session A Walk on the Wild Side. All right. Sorry I have no PowerPoint. These days I often do have PowerPoints, but I thought Barry's very old school. He's going to think, why are you putting on air as having a PowerPoint? Can't you just have a handout? No, I'm the only one without a PowerPoint. But little did I know, Barry's gotten up to speed. Okay, anyway, but handouts are nice, right? Because you can go back and forth and stuff. You can't do that with PowerPoint when you're thinking about it in the audience. So, all right, to borrow a phrase, I would describe the manifest image of typical mature human persons as one of, and you got this on your handout, are being persisting and unified, experiencing and self-conscious subjects, right? Not mere objects, but subjects. We are also reflective knowers who consciously understand at least some things, limits, quite a lot of limits to that. But and then finally, we are creative and purposive free doers, agents, who, having limited control over their own attention, cognition, and behavior, and being aware of options and reasons for pursuing each of them, are at times worthy of moral praise or blame for the choices that they make, and at times of a measure of credit for what they achieve. Let me immediately add to this, since we are talking about free will a lot, so you don't get the wrong idea. I think that such choices, while they have deep significance for us, are highly intermittent, right? Yeah, much of our waking lives, we're acting on autopilot. There are presumably subpersonal mechanisms that carry out standing intentions that we have, habitual routines that we engage in, instinctive reactions we have to things and the like, right? It's only episodically when we have occasion to contemplate alternative courses of action, and it's not just obvious to us what to do, we have to think about it, we've got competing motivations for one or more alternatives. All right, turning then from the manifest image of persons to the scientific image of the cosmos in its fundaments, that is the scientific image of the cosmos at the fundamental level, which is most of what we've been talking about here, with skipping biology, chemistry, and all that. While of course it's all still being sorted out, and some of you are engaged in that process of trying to sort it out, it posits an ontology and dynamics that are utterly devoid of any of the characteristics that show up in the manifest image of persons. So human persons, I assume, are wholly composed of cells, biological cells, that are themselves grounded in some way or other in the fundamental physical elements and their dynamics. Given that assumption, what's required to affirm, that is, affirm in a kind of self-conscious, fully explicit, worked out way, what's required to affirm both the manifest and the scientific, physical scientific images? What do subjectivity, conscious knowledge and understanding, and effective, purposive, and free action require in relation to the more fundamental physical processes of our world? This question is often discussed in a way that fails to acknowledge that it looks different, at least, when we see it through the prism of three different metaphysical schemes of causation and laws of nature. And I knew Barry would like acknowledging that, thinking about it differently. And as I'm thinking of these, I'll label them using familiar terms: a Humean conception, a so-called governing laws of nature conception, and what I'll call a causal powers or dispositionalist conception. Now, I have my own view of the basic metaphysics of causation, and you all have yours. Well, Peter might not, but most of the rest of you will probably have a view on this. And I imagine we have healthy representation from all three camps. Well, I don't know, Tim Baldwin's not here, so maybe we only have two representative camps. We'll see. So I thought it would be most useful, given the diversity of views on this more fundamental question, for us to collectively consider each framework in turn and ask whether strongly emergent, top-down causality, as it's sometimes put, and or causal indeterminism in human agency are well motivated from its perspective. And if so, what that might look like within its perspective. On this matter, I have a few proposals, occasional outrageous arguments, and also a few questions that I'll simply ask and won't really answer fully. I will give simple ecumenical statements of the three views. If you think that specific versions, and I think that Barry probably does, but if you think that specific versions of any of them make a difference to anything that I want to argue, well then you can go ahead and make that point in the discussion and we can talk about it. But I'll start off by assuming that these kind of very generic versions are sufficient for our purposes. I will spend most of my time on Humeanism as it raises the most distinctive issues. And well, I'm speaking, after all, in the Dragon's Lair here in New Brunswick, so I thought I should give the devil his due, right? Okay. All right, so we start with Humeanism. On this metaphysical framework, of course, causation is not part of the fundamental fabric of reality. Instead, we are, at least if we're David Lewis, Barry's got slight, anyways, you probably know this. Barry's in process, I think that's right, because some of your unpublished stuff is showing it's kind of slowly working away from a somewhat different way of thinking about Humeanism. But we'll start off with the kind of familiar picture. We're invited to suppose a total distribution of qualities through space and time. That's what's fundamental, a vast mosaic of very particular local facts. And this distribution, according to this view, fixes, that is, metaphysically necessitates the laws of nature, which in turn support counterfactuals, ground causal relations, and in Barry's words from something he wrote, scientifically explain particular events either via unification or through counterfactuals and causal relations. I think I give you on the handout, quote from Lewis on how to understand the concept of the law of nature. Perhaps other kinds of truths need to be added to it. Barry thinks so. Barry thinks you need to add symmetry principles, don't neatly fit Lewis's characterization. Barry and David would maybe add the past hypothesis. They think it's so fundamental to scientific explanation that it merits being thought of as a statement of it in the laws of nature. But okay, we won't worry about the details of that. Now, there are familiar, you might say, partisan worries about the suitability of the Humean framework for the very project of elucidating purposive agency. So putting on my partisan hat just for a moment, Humeanism, speaking from within here, this partisan hat, fits poorly, you might say, in other nearby respects. Its account of causation and causal explanation seemed really geared to impersonal systems, not persons. For personal agency, causal production, the idea of causal production, not mere counterfactual patterns, is the operative notion, right? I perform various actions. I produce the choice that leads me to behave in certain way, right? Okay, so, and you can develop that word in a certain kind of way. It doesn't really, Humeanism doesn't so much as imply, but strongly suggest a somewhat downgraded understanding of the category of substance, and so of persons as a special case. Because why? Because there's no real unity, you might say, to the nature of things, given the modal independence of momentary microfacts on this picture making up everything else. You don't have any kind of thing like an enduring nature that kind of persists over time. And you might think that's a word, right? And finally, most contentiously, you might think it just completely shipwrecks our epistemology to go in for Humeanism. Hume wasn't wrong for thinking he faced an insoluble problem of induction. Given the metaphysical conception he was attracted to. Okay, so, and you might think this kind of worry generalizes to the epistemology of agency. Okay, well, there are familiar Humean replies. In part, I won't summarize everything Humeans would say in response to all of this, but they'll say, look, reduction does not equal elimination. So the fact that causality is getting reduced is not to say that we don't think there is such a thing as causation. Primitive causality that gets appealed to on some non-Humean views is not really explanatory. Problem of induction is a problem for everyone, not just the Humean, and lots of other things besides. And it's sometimes alleged any kind of non-Humean view fits poorly with modern science, in particular fundamental physical science. All right. I mentioned these familiar disputes only to try to separate them from our question of how well emergent indeterminism can be motivated given the framework. So I'm going to say, don't raise partisan objections, just think from within the framework and then say, kind of look out at the manifest image and see what kind of possibilities look attractive within that framework. That's the spirit of what I'm going to try to do. Okay. So emergent indeterminism, right? Emergent, that is, they're being irreducible. Oh, I'll tell you what that means in a moment. I'll leave it at that impressionistic level. So what does it look like within the Humean framework? Well, it'll involve there being elemental features of consciousness and or intentionality, insofar as you might think these two are yoked, the intentionality of mental states, that sense of intentionality, as new natural properties, right alongside mass, charge, spin, or what have you, whatever, turns out to be a fundamental natural property on our best final physics. Okay, that's going to be a commitment of view. Which such features? Well, that would be for a future psychological science to try to determine. And then there's going to be psychological and psychophysical generalizations over those properties that have to be included among the best system of fundamental laws, right? So that's what's you're committed to if you go in for strong emergence. Indeterminism, what does that look like? Well, we're going to have a patchwork of laws if we incorporate this into our basic Humean metaphysics. We're going to have basic physical but incomplete, they're collectively incomplete set of laws that seamlessly describe physical evolutions in non-emergent configurations. But then we'll also have emergent laws describing the interactions that involve elemental conscious intentional properties together with neurophysiological, physical properties within subjects. And finally, given the indeterminism that if you want to go in for this for human action, then we're going to have irreducibly statistical generalizations that imply, in context of conscious deliberative processes, weighted distributions over a plurality of intentions to act, that is choice types, as a function of prior relevant conscious and brain states. A question I have that I'm just going to pose for now, given the radically singular psychological deliberative circumstances that obtain from case to case involving human agents, none of us is ever internally, externally embedded in precisely the same total context, given the radically singular nature of the circumstances conscious agents find themselves in. How plausible is it that there would be a Humean basis on the assumption of emergence of this kind for robust statistical generalizations across conscious deliberations? And if there isn't, then the alternative, it seems like, would be the absence of objective laws over such outcomes, perhaps replaced by rough and ready epistemic probabilities based on our knowledge of individual psychology. I'll come back to this question. I just raised that. All right. So how plausible is it that emergent indeterminism of the sort that I've just gestured at is necessary to secure the manifest image within the framework, assuming, again, that one is unmoved by partisan worries about Humeanism? Well, in defense of the compatibility of the manifest image with the contrary assumption of causal closure to physics, and the claim that all fundamental ontology is purely physical ontology, kind of the world as Carlos sees it, right? In defense of the compatibility of the manifest image with that, various philosophers, Berry among them, have pointed out that Humeanism readily allows for generalization and causation as the satisfaction of certain kinds of counterfactuals at many levels of nature, at many grains of the natural world. There's no causal explanatory competition that within the Humean picture. You can just have robust generalizations at different levels of structure, right? And I take this point to be correct as far as it goes. But its harmonizing target is mental causation. It says you don't need to suppose anything additional. Something robustly, strongly emergent, if your goal is just to harmonize mental causation with this kind of conception of the physical world. But it doesn't address the intrinsic character of subjective experience, of conscious intentional states or of conscious exercise of control over attention, cognition, behavior. In our immediate grasp of these states, which are all, I take it to be contentiously, of course, but I take them all to be basic features of the manifest image. So the anti-emergentist Humean, assuming she's not in the final analysis an illusionist with respect to one or more of these putative conscious data items that show up in the manifest image, it seems the anti-emergentist Humean must suppose that such conscious states are complex physical states whose similarity is not defined in terms of intrinsic quality. Perhaps they share physical structural types, but those are introspectively inaccessible and so are not plausibly what we're drawing upon when we take ourselves to notice similarity among our conscious states. So their contents, in fact, will be massively extrinsically determined, almost entirely farmed out to the states of and relations among many other entities. That is, sorry, this is the part where I'm skipping too quickly if you're not familiar with this, but the thought is, if you're going to, you have to understand mental states in functional terms, right? And on the Humean view, it's not that my current experiential state or conscious belief state right now is intrinsically disposed to interact with other psychological states that I have right now and within my psychology. Rather, because causation is not a matter of fundamental dispositionality, causation is a matter of there being the right kinds of broad patterns, right? And so the supervenient space for the right kinds of patterns are going to be, it's going to, depending on what's going on across cognizing agents across space and time, right? Even if we just restrict ourselves to, the human population, that's a broad enough base. It's going to be very extrinsically determined, right? It's not a matter of just intrinsically what's going on. It's in fact, it's fundamentally a matter of its being of my set of states and the patterns that they exhibit, reflecting much broader patterns out there in the world. And so the grasping, you might say, of intrinsic phenomenal character necessarily, I think, drops out of the picture on the Humean view. Yeah, I'm going to skip over this. Okay, so it seems to me then that emergence is motivated for those Humeans who wish to reconcile the manifest and scientific images, but not as a response to the problem of mental causation, which I concede that it defangs, but instead as a response to the problem of intrinsic conscious character in its several modes. Now, Carlo and perhaps others here seem to understand naturalism such that naturalism just entails the causal completeness of physics, whatever or whatever final physics delivers, right? And so that makes me a non-naturalist. But with Jessica, I find that kind of stipulation of what naturalism entails tendentious. Let's say that a property, law, or other proposition is fundamental, just in case it's a component of a minimally sufficient condition for metaphysically determining all the truths of the universe. That's whatever you need to get the job done minimally. That's your base of fundamental elements, right? It then becomes an interesting substantive question whether our world is such that all its fundamental elements in that sense are basic, right? That is, elements of a true basic physical theory. And there are boring and exciting answers to that question, right? Beautiful perhaps, but boring, right? So some of us take the apparent pervasive features of our conscious lives that I've been gesturing at to be evidence that we live in an exciting world, not a boring. That's all I'll say about that. All right, what about indeterminism? Well, we've all noted the consequence argument, the past and the laws are not up to me, yet if the laws are deterministic, they entail my future acts. What is not up to me transfers across logical entailment. That's one version of the consequence argument. One response, various philosophers, people have referenced the Beebe and Mealy article, and Jenan Ishmael, I think, is inclined to endorse something like this, but she can tell me if I'm wrong about that. So they point out that on Humeanism, laws are merely generalizations over particular matters of fact, including particular future choices and actions. Laws on this view don't antecedently govern those facts or constrain them in some way. My future acts then are in, from that fact and the broader Humean picture, they are not metaphysically determined by anything prior to the acts, explanatorily prior to the acts themselves. These philosophers then suggest that it follows that I am able to act differently than I will act, right? Even if determinism is true. However, this inference is hasty. Barry and Peter and this morning indicated that they agree that this is not a good reason to think that the Humean has an easy response to the consequence argument. But my reason for rejecting this appeal to the mere generalization account of laws aspect of Humeanism as a reason for rejecting the consequence argument, my reason for thinking that's a bad response is not Barry's. I don't know about Peter. He can tell us. So on Humeanism, and here's the reason why. Here's why I think it's not a good. It doesn't defang the argument. On Humeanism, there is a chain of metaphysical determination that runs as follows. Do I have this on the handout here? Yes. I'm working from notes. Yeah, you see this under rejoinder on page 2. Okay. So there is a chain of metaphysical determination that starts with the mosaic, the grand mosaic of facts, which determines the laws, which determine what abilities a person has, right? Any kind of agent acting, which determines what kind of control one has, right? Over one's own actions and subsequently future events. So for Humean, the Humean, laws are preconditions on causal power, of which abilities are a special case. And I take this to be contrary to what Beebe and Mealy say when they write, from that Humean perspective, there is a sense in which our abilities are not constrained by the laws of nature. That was a quote, from which they even allow that, quote, we are able to jump over large buildings in a single bound, if Humeanism is true, end quote. They call this metaphysical ability. Okay, well, I'm not going to try to analyze agential ability, that is the ability to act, the sense of ability that we apply to agents, purposive agents. But I contend that it entails a kind of reliable control, okay? One-off occurrences do not an ability make. So the fact that something can, in a kind of metaphysical sense, that something can happen in me does not entail, and it's not equivalent to saying that it's something I can do, right? So when we consider a deterministic Humean world similar to our own, then perhaps the laws might have been slightly different as a consequence of my body's, it's on a consequence of the sheer contingency of my body's having moved differently. But my abilities would not have been different in such a scenario. so, right, to get the idea, so if we suppose that in our world, everything that happens is determined, and then the Humean says, but look, it could have, there was nothing that kept it, so in fact, you raised your hand to illustrate a point in the philosophy seminar at a particular point in time. It was nothing constrained the fact, metaphysically constrained the fact that you never raised your arm at that very moment. It could have occurred, right? And so the question is, all right, so then we say, imagine that scenario, right? When you weren't contemplating keeping your arm down, right? Is that a scenario where you exercised an ability not to raise your arm? And I want to say, no, that would be a scenario where just capriciously, as a matter of fluke, right? Your arm went up, right? And so that wasn't something so even though it might be possible on the Humean metaphysics in a sense that have occurred, it's not a possibility in which I do something differently from what I do. It's just a possibility where an event happens that I'm not exercising control over. So another way to put the point then is that while on Humeanism, the events that are my future actions are deeply contingent, ontologically independent of all other past and future events, that they are actions, that they are expressions of abilities, is not so independent. It's not independent of all other events, right? Given that abilities supervene on powers, which supervene precisely on all other events. Okay, so there are at least two basic senses in which we might have dual abilities of choice and action, that is the ability to do or not to do something. I just want to point this out, right? General, right? We all have, lots of things have abilities, right? Not just human agents. We have general abilities. I have the ability to think about philosophy problems. I have that when I'm sleeping, right? I have the ability, I retain a general ability to play basketball when my arms are tied behind my back, right, in a chair by some captor or whatever, right? There's a sense of, right, general abilities persist. But then there's this more here and now sense of ability. That is, what am I able to do in the current circumstances? And of course, it's this second sense that's at issue in the free will debate. When we think of what we do is sometimes up to us, such that we're able to do otherwise. Compatibilists typically explicate it as you're having the general ability and it's not being rendered temporarily inoperative by external or internal compulsion, external manipulation, failures of basic rationality and the like. Incompatibilists are guided by the thought that strict inability to render some proposition true or false transfers across logical entailment. Therefore, I'm not really able here and now to act differently than I in fact do if my exercising that ability would require an antecedent miracle or change in the past. I have nothing to add to this debate. We've been talking about it at length in various sessions. I side with incompatibilists. But if you ask, is there some other special reason for the Humean to reject the incompatibilist stance on this question, on how to understand the relevant notion of ability? I don't see that there is. This transfer of inability thesis seems independent of Humean metaphysics. Okay, I'm gonna leave that there. Let me press on. So let's take up our second metaphysical scheme, the governing laws conception, or what Barry earlier called bad metaphysics. All right, on this view, here's my simple summary statement of the basic idea. Laws are real features of the natural world that are, I should say, real fundamental features of the natural world that are not identical to nor fixed by any sum of actual events, and that naturally necessitate, constrain transitions among events going from past to the future. Natural necessitation here functions kind of like a restricted form of logical necessitation. And it's ontologically prior to importantly, it's prior to and explanatory of observed regularities. Again, I'll pause very briefly to note partisan worry or two about the suitability of this framework for thinking about purposive agency. It can seem first worry, it can seem that governing laws have a weirdly top-down efficacy. You might say over the top efficacy because it's global. It's some kind of weird global factor that's driving all the world's events. And you might think this kind of goes hand in glove with a kind of conception of matter as intrinsically inert, right? But it doesn't really fit well then with the notion of purposive self-moving agents, right? Okay, that's one worry. Second worry, if you think about the divine lawgiver origin of this notion of natural laws, purposive agency, starting with God's, is metaphysically more fundamental than laws on this picture, right? And then to embrace laws as instead a replacement for the divine lawgiver is to take a kind of revisionist stance towards naive thought on which agential causal power is not metaphysically derivative. Yeah, it's to make it to be metaphysically derivative from the laws. Whereas, if you think about the 17th century divine, God gives the laws, assigns the laws. You have in the background, right, a conception of God's power. It's not lawgiver, right? So agential power, special agent, but they tended to make similar exceptions for human beings as well. And the thought is, once you change the picture by just saying, no, it's just the laws that are primitive, that are doing it, you might find this a kind of inhospitable frame. Well, what's the reply going to be? I take it basically it is, look, deal with it. Whenever its origins, right? This kind of way of this kind of ontology of laws has proved theoretically essential in modern scientific theorizing, and so it's proved its merits. And so you've got it. All right. So again, let's agree to set aside then partisan misgivings one might have about the view and try to think from within the governing laws framework. All right. So emergent indeterminism, again, what does that look like? Well, both elements, it seemed to me, look very similar to the Humean counterpart. And that's why on your handout, it looks very similar to what's given under the Humean view. We just have to add the proviso that laws are fundamentally constraining. All right. So you can just see what's there on the handout. So again, how plausible is it that emergent indeterminism is necessary to secure the manifest image within the framework? All right, well, the emergence aspect of that question, we have, as with Humean, we still have to deal with the intrinsic character of subjective experience in all of its modes, right? And that, if it motivates on the Humean view, in a strongly emergent picture, it does the same here. But also, I wonder about this. I'm just going to suggest this, but maybe I'm wrong. So it's really kind of a question. You might think there's a further reason on this conception. Non-emergent special science macro laws. So on this picture, you have governing laws, but those are going to be fundamental physical laws, right? Now, if you think about special sciences, chemistry, biology in its various aspects, as well as other special sciences you might countenance, I'll call these non-emergent special science macro laws, right? These don't clearly govern in quite the same sense as the fundamental laws do under this picture. That is, I take it they're not equally constraining, natural, necessitating. At any rate, they're not doing it directly. It's a derivative sense in which these laws govern. So why? But that's not a well-articulated kind of worry. But I'll leave it at that. If that's right, why would you worry about that? Why would you see that as motivation to say special science laws aren't good enough? For the purposes of securing the manifest image, well, you might think that causal counterfactuals of action and of our mental lives that are backed by governing laws would be more robust than those governed by weaker laws. Anyway, I'm not clear on this question. So maybe you have thoughts on that. As for indeterminism, the argument for it is, if anything, more straightforward, right? Why you would want indeterminism than it is on the Humean picture. The governing laws and the past, it's a kind of basic commitment of the view that the governing laws and the past are explanatorily prior to the future, right? That's the way the view is developed. Okay, finally, nearest and dearest to my own heart, the causal powers, dispositional causality kind of view. It's got more ideology going on in this picture. So first, we need a sparse ontology of immanent natural properties. And these are plausibly thought of as inherently dependent modes of substances or objects. The word substance sort of triggers all kinds of reactions in you. Don't load that. I'm not intending to load that up in ways that you might find objectionable. Just say objects, okay? But they're kind of dependent aspects of things. But they're real. It's not just a way of describing things, right? They're really there, and you can think of them as either tropes. Particular instances, right? Or so Eddie the electron has a trope of negative charge, and Eleanor the electron has a distinct individual instance of negative charge, right? Or you could think of them as Armstrongian universals. I think the trope view works better, but that's a partisan issue. All right. Natural properties, here's crucial to this view, is that natural properties of this sort are in part or in whole causal powers. And that's a fundamental bit of ideology. That's part of their very nature, their dispositions towards effects. More precisely, each type of property at a time in a context causally contributes in a characteristic manner alongside other powers to the joint production of later property instances in other things. Right, that's part of their very nature, is to do that. Right, they've got a dispositional profile. That's the nature of these properties. So it's part of the dispositional profile of negative charge to interact with other instances of negative charge as a function of distance, and depending on what else is going on, absent countervailing forces, right, to repel similarly charged particles. With a certain measure of strength, or to attract oppositely charged particles, right? That's the picture, where this notion of production is a kind of sui generis, dynamical species of metaphysical necessitation. So then natural laws on this picture are not fundamental. Natural laws are grounded. They're regularities that are grounded in the exercise of powers, perhaps together with certain framework principles that are needed to complete the job, or some natural laws perhaps simply describe how powers compose. Finally, just a quick comment on causation. The powers theory is not about a kind of a type of relation out there in the world that is squarely in view in everyday causal discourse. At least it's not plausibly given as an account, right, of that sort. Instead, it figures centrally in the grounding of such discourse where true. That is, I think the powers theorists should allow that ordinary usage only imperfectly tracks the features of fundamental reality that ground the truths of causal dependency that they express. So just to make this clear to people, right? So it's just a part of ordinary causal talk to say that absences can cause certain effects, right? Your plant died because you failed to water it, right? But there's no absence as an entity that has a kind of weird, spooky, primitive causal disposition that's doing work there, right? But nonetheless, so that's a true statement. That's the way so the notion of causation in ordinary speech is related to, it's in fact, it's related to the notion of causation that is in view for this kind of theorist, but they're not precisely the same notion. Anyway, I just want to say that because sometimes there's confusion over that. Sometimes people give quick refutations of this view by appealing to what people would ordinarily say about causation or something like that. I think that's just misguided. All right, partisan worries about the suitability of this framework? None. Yeah.
That's what it's for.
Great. Yeah. This framework, right? It easily allows variance. You can do all kinds of funky things with this framework if you want fundamentally teleological kinds of powers. For purposes you can have, right? You can. It's a flexible framework. All right. So now emergent indeterminism. What does it look like on this picture? Well, here's the picture the way I think about it. So emergent powers come from somewhere. They don't just come in out of nowhere, right? So the idea is basic natural properties interact in certain kinds of ways. They manifest certain causal propensities ubiquitously, right? But they also have latent dispositions to generate collectively in the right kinds of organized configurations, strongly emergent fundamental properties, right? And what are those organizational kinds of contexts? Well, that's a matter for future science to figure out, but these are plausibly functionally specified, okay? So the idea is if you're a Laplacian observer looking at the universe, right? You're tracking the universe in the early stages. Let's suppose there's no funky kinds of emergence for a long, long time. And you quickly figure out what the fundamental, so you've got a theory and you're a causal powers kind of Laplacian theorist. And so you're saying, okay, I got negative charge, got this kind of power, and they combine, and we can get these elegant laws and so forth. And so then at a certain point in the evolution of the world's history, boom, there's that first occasion on which what happens is not at a microphysical level. It does not conform to what you were expecting, right? And then you begin to see more and more instances like that. And you notice that these always occur in certain specifiable kinds of relatively macroscopic contexts, right? And so eventually, if you're smart enough and you notice enough of this phenomena occurring, you realize, okay, so it seems like when a certain type of configuration is attained, right, a new kind of power enters the mix. It itself has its own causal profile, right, and interacts with the other basic powers in a certain kind of way, right? That's kind of how it would look to our Laplacian observer. So, the exercise of strongly emergent properties, if it's occurring in conscious agents, is responsive in turn to functionally defined macro states. That's what we form intentions in relation to our functionally defined macroscopic context, right? So the point here is that strong emergence depends in an interesting way on weak emergence, on the way I'm thinking about it. Sometimes people who go in for strong emergence, which is what I've been describing to you, often are kind of dismissive. Weak emergence is just when you get complex systems that kind of exhibit stable regularities, and they say, well, it's still ontologically speaking, it's still kind of a reductionistic picture. It's, forget about that. That's uninteresting. The Laplacian observer would be bored by that. She doesn't need it, right? She can just do the microphysics and get a complete understanding of how the universe is the trajectory of its evolution, whether as a probabilistic function, deterministic function, and weak emergence is what limited cognizers who are stuck at a certain macroscopic level of powers of perception and so forth are limited to. But on this view, there's strong emergence has a certain kind of dependency on weak emergence. I just think that's kind of interesting. That was really a comment for Jessica. She might run with that. Okay. Finally, the indeterminist aspect of this. Okay. All right, we're getting there. We're almost there. Well, you're going to have here, because we got powers, which are kind of intrinsic propensities, we're going to have single case propensities or powers that are getting manifested, right? So what about indeterministic agency? So we're always subject to myriad influences. And I take it that these influences make more or less likely that I'm going to do this or that over time. So let's say I engage in a very short interval of deliberation about what to do. I only contemplate a few possibilities, all right? And that's it. That's pretty much given how I'm configured psychologically and physically, what my environment's like. There are only a few possibilities for what I might do. And as I deliberate, there can be a kind of dynamically evolving objective probability of what anyway, as certain considerations seem more salient than they had just a moment ago, right? It's just going to be dynamically evolving right up to the time of choice. But the choice itself is an expression of a fundamental capacity to choose. It's a propensity. All right. How plausible is it for this framework? Do I have anything I want to add here? Yeah. No, maybe I'll just close with this since I've been speaking long. I want to say something about chance. Right? So some of you are going to say, okay, this is a crazy metaphysical picture. But even if we spot it, how is this going to help? Right? Some people have this kind of work, right? All you're succeeding in doing is sketching the bare coherence of a scenario on which what we decide to do and subsequently do is a matter of chance, right? It's random. To the degree you're supposing, right, you've got these indeterministic propensities, right? Then how you exercise those propensities are to that very degree a matter of chance. And how is that conferring on you the kind of control, right, that we think we have, such that, if it's the right kind of choice, I might bear more responsibility for the choice, right? How are you fully in control? Well, there's a lot I could say about this, and maybe I will in the discussion, but I'll just say this. We can perfectly well understand, we can perfectly well explain undetermined choices, right? We just have to understand that not all explanation has to be contrastive in form, right? Not all explanation has to have the form of why did you do this rather than that. That's the contrast, the untaken alternative path, right? We can give contrastive explanations in lots of contexts, right? Why did this happen rather than that, right? Where we have a sufficient condition that precludes that from having occurred just then, right? Okay, and so we can positively explain what's responsible for what actually happened, and we can so describe the situation that it precluded the alternative. So why P rather than Q? Q was precluded by all the causal factors that came to bear on the situation, right? So that generates a form of contrastive explanation. But we can also non-contrastively explain why something occurs simply by talking about the causal factors that directly led to it, that promoted it as one among several possibilities for what might have occurred, right? So if I have reasons for staying in on a sunny Saturday afternoon to work on a talk or to go out, take a walk out in the park, I have different motivations, and depending on what I do, in each case, there is and would have been a non-contrastive explanation for the alternative that that which I did. What is added? So I'm exercising a power of choice. There's an explanation for why I exercised the power of choice as I did on that occasion. It's not a contrastive explanation, but contrastive explanation is not some kind of gold standard. It's not the case that non-contrastive explanation is somehow a kind of defective kind of explanation, right? It's just that contrastive explanation is a type of explanation that's available in a certain kind of causal context, and it's not it's just not suited to other kinds of indeterministic contexts. And then if you say, yeah, well, but then it's a matter of chance. What is meant by that term chance or random in this context, right? I'm aware of what I'm doing. I'm aware of my reasons, and I'm choosing in the light of my reasons. Yeah, but I had the capacity to have chosen different. I think so very often the words chance and random just they're just argument stoppers here in this context. They're supposed to, I get to pin the label on you, stipulate. That's just what it is. If it's undetermined, it's chance. And then that's necessarily a kind of pejorative label, right? It necessarily means you've got an inherently non-controlled circumstance. But I think that's illegitimate, right? We ought to be able to not use those words and get across and make whatever criticism is needed. All right, but I'll stop with that.
Okay, so I will organize things so I don't get the talk. Except I'll say that Carlos' talk goes back to Reichenbach. Yours sounded to me like back to Aristotle. So that's what Carlos first.
Okay, team. This is really interesting. Couple of points. Let me first say that I think it's true that we sort of belong to different tribes.
Speak loudly.
I think it's sort of true that we belong to different tribes.
Yeah.
And as such, we can sort of respectively communicate and try to clarify, not try to convince anything. If there's only one thing I disagree is your use of exciting and boring.
Yeah.
All the rest there.
Sure, I'm just having a little fun there.
Yeah. So 2 points. One is more substance, the second is really clarification. 1 point is when you say, which is sort of a key point, seems to me, in the second page at the beginning, you say, but it doesn't help you to the human. I take human here in the sense of human, not the sense of human.
Okay.
It doesn't help with intrinsic character, subjective experience, conscious intentional states, conscious exercise of control, potential conditions, and immediate aspects. You say it doesn't help, and you just say it. Later on, you go to your preferred power disposition, you sketch a thing, and then you say, well, of course, it would be a matter of future science to fill up all the story. Why isn't it interesting, the matter of current science, which is actually filling up all the story in a human, not in housing. What I'm saying,
Filling up which story? The physical story or neuro?
it sounds
Psychological
just take
story?
it how it sounds. It
Yeah.
sounds to me that when you say it doesn't help for the character of subjective experience, you're doing what Nagel does all the time. Namely, it cannot work, therefore I don't want to look at the science who's doing that. But there's a lot of science who's working exactly on trying to understand the kind of things you were talking about. So processes that happen in a human being when is confronted choice, for instance, a responsible choice, and trying to understand that in terms which make sense of this sort of the soul searching, of the decision, of the lack of clarity about the decision, of this interesting equilibrium between we know what are the causes that lead to a decision, and we don't know what are the causes of the decision. So it's not, as you were saying at the end, it's not chance, so cannot reconstruct the actual causal set of relations that make the decision. All that, there's a lot of science in biology, in sciences, evolutionary theory that account for. So that's what. So why? And the idea of a causal power that somehow strongly emerges play no role whatsoever in helping in understanding. Let me get to the second point, because it's they're two different, but maybe the second point helps.
Yeah.
You quoted me on naturalism at the beginning, and I understand, and I it's not exactly, but I want to go and try to look what I mean by that, what I meant by that. I said you're part of nature, but what I was not thinking of naturalism in the sense of, you know, Reichenbach I mentioned, the kind of wine. I was thinking of Spinoza, where you have an account exactly of what I was talking about a moment ago, and the kind of things you were talking about at the end of your talk, which is an account in Spinoza, very detailed, in which there's no doubt there's moral responsibility, which play a major role in the story. There are emotions, there are the feeling of a power, the power, but not fundamental. There is a story about the complexity, but there is absolute determinism, very, very strong. And just give me 30 seconds. Spinoza's story is the following. We have an image. We generate an image of what happens outside. So we have a representation of what happens outside. We use that to partially, to some extent, predict what happens. We also have an image of ourselves. And we make a prediction of what happened ourselves. We can know what we know what we're going to do. We work in the way we work because we are designed to conserve ourselves. In a sense, without an explicit Darwinian thing, it's this idea that we're a machine that preserves itself. But the picture that we have about ourselves, so we have a picture of the picture of ourselves, is incomplete, which is perfectly coherent.
Sure.
This incompleteness is what gives us the sense of non-motivation in some of our choices, sort of the spontaneity of some of sources. And the way Spinoza puts it is that we're well aware of our motives, well aware of our intention, well aware of our design, generally are not aware why we design, but not because there are no motives, there are no choices, it's just we don't know that. And there's more than that, because there's also the psychological explanation, which I think is the best part of Spinoza about free will, of why we want to hold on to the idea that it's that there aren't those motives, because we're proud of ourselves and we don't be proud of ourselves. And this Spinoza diagnosis of why we are so offended by the idea that there could be determinism. The determinism in Spinoza is fundamental, just the basis of all this view of the world. This is a deeply rational system. And I mean, he framed that in terms of God, but it's really in terms of natural laws in the sense of regularities. So that's what I mean by naturalism, not flat science. I'm not trying to argue into this point, because I do understand, as I said, a big thing. But it seems to me you're dismissing it and flattening it.
Okay. Good, thanks. So, right, current science is psychological science, neurobiological science, evolutionary psychology science, right? A range of sciences, I agree, are currently engaged of projects of trying to illuminate consciousness, generally, conscious experience, cognition, action, right? Different sciences are taking up different kinds of tasks. What I deny about, I don't deny that they have lots to teach us, and they're going to. And much of what they will develop in such a way that there will be powerful, partial but illuminating explanations don't appeal to anything like a notion of emergence. I agree with that. Although they still have a long ways to go. It's the only thing I would say. Neuroscience of consciousness is in its infancy, right? They don't have, I mean, there's been a recent proliferation of, speculative proposals for how to think neurobiologically about consciousness, for example. When I last asked a neuroscientist who specializes in this, she said 13 that she knew, right? But there's probably about 4 that are kind of currently receive a lot of attention. But I think when you actually look at, and I'm respectful of the science, but the way they describe what they're doing very often, there's often confusion about what the target of explanation really is. And what I think, there's still good science going on, but the description of what the science is trying to do, I think, is often it mischaracterizes itself. So just to focus on the consciousness, subjectivity kind of thing. What you're getting is proposals with some evidence behind them for certain kinds of neurophysiological correlates, certain kinds of functions associated with consciousness, and where those functions might be realized within the brain, right? Basically, and say a lot about those details there, but what they're not doing is if it's saying, what they're not doing is, if you look at those functional explanations, right, for what's going on, they're not giving you anything like, oh, and that's why your experience has this kind of rich qualitative character that it has. They're not giving you an explanation that even purports, I think, to be doing that. So they're really not, but they are, what they're trying to do, but they're taking seriously based on people's reports, their own reports, right? They're taking seriously conscious experience, and then they're trying to get at some of the underpinnings. What's going on within the brain when people are having such experiences, right? But they're not plausibly giving you anything like an account of conscious experience itself, what its intrinsic nature is. I mean, there's lots more to be said about that, but I think if you look at that and you're careful at looking at the kinds of explanations, that's all we're getting so far. But I think it's undoubtedly going to be helpful. There's all kinds of sciences that deal with human action, and we've learned some things, right? Not shocking things, but we've learned we're fallible about our grasp. We only have a partial grasp on our own motivations. I think that's might be true, but you can go back to ancient wisdom literature, and you already had, human beings have been aware of this, at least reflective human beings for a long time. So this is true, but modern psychology is bringing out to a greater degree than we would have anticipated that this is sometimes true. It's often context dependent, right? The limitations on our awareness and our own motivations. But we don't have anything like even proposed quasi-deterministic explanations that would yield predictions of human action in a given context. We don't have that. We have very rough statistical generalization. I mean, give me an example from either neuroscience or just cognitive psychology of a prediction of a human being making a choice that has some significance for that person, where there's more than one option that's interestingly different, and they're contemplating. Did somebody say limit? No. Okay. Don't say limit. That's such a terrible argument. I think neuroscientists, trust me, I'm on a 4-year grant project with a bunch of neuroscientists and philosophers, right? Neuroscientists have absorbed the lesson. Limit has nothing to teach us about free will. Sorry, I can't get into that. But if pushed, I'll talk about the limit stuff. The stuff about brain activity that we pick up on prior to your having the conscious awareness of the person. All right, sorry, I didn't know if you said that, but give me an example of what you have in mind. I'm not aware of it. Yeah.
Plenty of phenomena in science give only statistical predictions, and nobody would think that there is some strong emergence to justify that.
Sure, good.
Hurricanes
Good, I agree.
are predictable, but
Good.
nobody says, oh, there is some mysterious strong emergence there.
Good, and that's where I think the appeal to, I talked about the manifest image, how it seems to us when we act, right? Now, sure, you can follow Spinoza and just assume, well, this is just an appeal to ignorance. We're just not fully aware of what's going on. There are always sufficient conditions at the psychological macro level of description for what human beings do. It's just that we're because we have such limited understanding of the factors that bear on it, we don't know. It feels to us, right? It seems to you, right? Well, okay, but that's a debunking explanation. That's saying we shouldn't take seriously the experience of action where I feel it's in my power. I can do this, I can do that, I can do a variety of things. I think that to be a positive aspect of my experience of my own agency.
Carlo, I think I should say that this is a long discussion.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Peter wanted to get in,
Okay.
other
No,
people.
but this is just.
So I'm
Okay.
Peter,
Yeah.
you're gonna-
Oh, I had a completely different thing. Point to make about the ontology that underlies this sparse ontology of imminent natural properties, inherently dependent modes of substances, all this Aristotelian kind of stuff. Well, I mean, this is, to my mind, I guess you understand that stuff. To me, it's just words. But what I want to know is why you need an ontology at all. I mean, if I do a physics problem, so I just was reading about Arthur C. Clarke, who invented the idea of a geosynchronous satellite. How do you do that? Oh, yeah, well, there's two formulas for centripetal acceleration. You can solve it for R. I could go through that calculation easily enough and not have any ontology of mathematics at all. Why does any explanation at this level need an ontology that's so specifically on one side of the great metaphysical divide to Plato and Aristotle, or maybe nominalism as well?
I mean, need for what purpose? Need for.
Well, why is it there?
Why would one go for any of these three
No,
options?
why does when you're talking about explaining human behavior, right?
Right.
Why, when we're doing that, as opposed to when we're doing ontology and trying to figure out what the basic constituents of the world are, what does this project need to include anything about ontology?
I think it needs to include something about ontology. That I make no claim that it has to include this framework. That's why that's why I looked at all three, right? I'm not saying that somehow you can't
But
make sense
why
out
wouldn't
of.
the explanations look pretty much the same no matter what ontology you have?
Well, I gave some reasons for thinking there were a little bit of differences in each case, how you work out the details, right? But so I'm not quite sure what
So
your
it's
question
okay,
is.
you want to say this at the level of very fine detail. See, I get the impression that this was an important part of your program to have imminent universals, things like that involved.
I'm saying if you go for this picture, then this is part of the machinery of the metaphysics of causation and of laws, right? And so then you filter, you say, what does emergence, right? Because you don't have to be an emergentist to go for kind of a neo-Aristotelian kind of conception of causation, right? Lots of people do who are not emergentists, okay? And so I was just trying to sort of flesh out what that entails.
So why couldn't I be an emergentist no matter what my ontology?
You could. Perhaps. I mean, I described what it looks like at least under these three views. Now, you are wanting to say, why do I have to buy any of these three views? That's a further step.
Why in this project do we have to? In other projects, yeah, I agree that we have to decide on what our ontology is. When you're trying to describe human behavior and human free behavior, responsible behavior, mental causation, stuff like that, I don't see why the abstract ontology stuff is relevant.
It's not that it's being recruited because it's relevant. It's just trying to say, if you have the antecedent commitment to one of these frameworks, what does this picture look like within my preferred ontology? That's what the aim was. Very inviting. And so this is the real, so the psychological reason, there is a Humean. I've got a kind of neo-Aristotelian kind of view. right? Other people have this kind of laws conception, and you might think that, how the details or how the motivations work for certain elements of this kind of emergent indeterminism might look a little different. So let's look and see. That was the goal. So we're going to kind of trot through these three kind of filters and see how it looks. Now you're wondering, how about if I just don't have any view at all, maybe? And so then I take it you're just saying, I believe there are true statements. Ultimately, science is just giving a lot of statements and relations among statements, true statements according to the theory or something like that, but without any, there's no implied metaphysics at all, not nominalism, not, I don't know what your alternative is. That's not one of these three. I'm not saying there isn't one, just wondering what, but I think you're misunderstanding what the point of the exercise was. That's my short answer.
Okay. You're gonna ask,
But
the second.
Okay, I give up. I had yeah, perhaps sort of a detailed question that isn't super important to the larger point here. But I was intrigued by your point about causation.
Yeah.
Right. And so as a preface, I like my causation really lightweight, right? Perhaps for like the reasons you just said. And I'm just wondering, I think what you said is exactly right. If the Aristotelian picture is what you want, you should say these things like, well, the actual cause aren't going to figure squarely in our causal talk, whatever conclusion it was. But as soon as you say that, I started wondering, why call that causation? Right. So if our causal talk seems to track something broadly in the world, such as something super lightweight, counterfactual dependence, whatever you want, why would we call something else causation instead? Just
yeah, I mean that's a fair question. It might be just the way of characterizing. If you've got this kind of ontology of primitive dispositionality, it's very natural to advert to causal language in describing the view itself. Maybe so. It's tracking fairly closely. But the thought is just ordinary language causal talk is not. Right, just like a lot of ordinary language talk, often it's saying things about the world, but it's not purporting to be saying anything about what fundamentally grounds the truth of what's being said. And so there's a little bit of leeway for someone with a kind of set of metaphysical commitments informed by science about what precisely in the world it is, in virtue of what that these kind of statements are true. But you're right. I mean, it's a kind of, you're saying there's a kind of properties have a certain kind of nature, right? They confer on objects. It's got a kind of ideology to understand it, which is kind of dispositionality. And the claim is it's the interaction of these things, in virtue of which ordinary talk about causal relations are true. And yeah, should we call that, kind of metaphysical causation, or, fundamental causation, or should we just, in order to avoid maximize chances of non-confusion, say, let's not even use the word and come up with a better one? It might be. It's just right. Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I've thought about it.
Thanks. So if I saw for people like, so Jeanette and Jessica, questions, is this true? Jessica, remember all the time you take up. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not including the time of my question.
Yeah, so my question has to do, it's really just trying to occupy your stance as regards these different frameworks from a specific perspective, namely this question of laws.
Yeah.
And looking at the Humean and the governing laws approach, why wouldn't you say, or could you say, that if we're really, trying to accommodate libertarian free will, basically that kind of agency, right? You just are not going to have anything resembling laws, no matter how you can understand that. Or those features, those broadly basic features, statistical generalizations or anything like that, at best, those are going to be accidental or descriptive. They're not going to be getting at anything about, what the having of power means for the flow of events. And so I just wanted to see if you thought that was right. And if so, that, it was really kind of a pressing concern with the first two conceptions, but also to ask you, it looked like you were maybe gesturing at that when you said there's conceptual room for supposing that
Right.
the power space conceptions are not governed by determinate probability. So I thought that was cool. So that's just one question, but then also to the extent that you want to keep the strongly emergent interactions, so to speak, non-law governed, but still embed them in lawful goings on, so to speak, right?
Right.
So there's room for laws,
Right.
vertical laws, for example, such that when you have such and such configurations and you end up with such and such fundamental powers, right? And then you also need something about how, given the outcome of a choice, you've got some new energy or force or something that can now go down and interfere with the low-level physical goings on. So there are laws that are associated with the power, but the power itself can't be law governed, in my view. It's going to be genuinely authoritarian.
Okay. Yeah. Some people want to say that. Dirk Pereboom, who thinks free will would require. He's kind of the radical libertarian. Free will would require indeterminism of the right sort, but it has to be non-law governed. And since it's very implausible empirically, he thinks that human behavior is not even so much as statistically law governed. Therefore, we don't have free will, right, or whatever, right? And there are other libertarians who don't think they have a more optimistic take on what the science demands, and they say there's no reason to suppose it's law governed. Right. I kind of left that out. But right, there are hints on the handout that I didn't bring out talk. My own reason for thinking is, look, I have the power to form choices at various times, but I'm never neutral, right? I'm always disposed to. I mean, this seems introspectively true. I'm more or less strongly inclined towards various options. I'm never just, serenely above the fray, just surveying options as a pure rational, non-desiring, cognizer or something like that, right? And I'm not sure how you make out that idea of more or less strongly inclined, if not in statistical, dispositional terms of varying degree. I think you're going to quickly get into the realm of probabilistic or at least statistical generalization or something, right? That has to answer to something. And I don't know what the alternative is. So that's one reason. But then there is this real question, though: how does this interface with micro dispositionality and this kind of irreducibly macro dispositionality? How plausible is it that we get robust generalizations? But a worry. So here's a place, maybe in a way, it kind of answers Peter's question, the way I was batting up. There's a worry on the Humean or the law governed picture. So it's not clear that they have room for, because for the idea of, you have causation, right? But it's grounded in laws. So the idea of causation out in the wild, ungoverned by laws, is not constrained in an interest, is a non-starter within that framework. So it would seem like in that framework that if you're a human, so if you have an antecedent commitment to Humeanism, you might say, I've got a real reason to be worried about this emergent indeterministic aspect, because if you can't fit that as a law-like, albeit emergent kind of thing, then what do you mean you're calling that a kind of power? You haven't earned your right to talk that way if it's not governed by some kind of robust law. So I think the stakes are raised whereas it seemed like on the third picture, right, the idea of power as such, if it's this kind of primitive, right, this goes back to Anscombe's causality and determination. Because our concept of causation does not seem conceptually tied to determinism, right? And probably, although she doesn't emphasize this as much, to statistical propensity, perhaps. But the human ideology and the law's ideology says, no, it is. It's a matter of doctrinal commitment that it is. I take it. Barry will correct me if I'm wrong.
No, and it's a good thing too.
Okay, all right. So that's a place where the options are more constrained, I think, there. So good question.
Okay, so Janan, you're not going to ask a question? We have like 5 minutes. I will ask the question. No, he's up for 5 minutes. I was very puzzled by how you think what's going on. If I heard you right, you think that whatever the fundamental whatevers are, fields or whatever,
Right.
when they get into certain complicated situations, they do something surprising. So before that, they conform to the fundamental dynamical laws, whatever they might be, Schrodinger's law. But now they're in this new situation. They behave in a new way.
Well, it's not that they so much behave in a new way as they generate a new set of features, new basic features.
But I want to know about
fundamental
the fundamental stuff. Do they move around differently or don't they?
Because there are new features, they interact with new features, and so yeah, they're.
So they move around differently. So the
But
fundamental.
they're still governed by the same.
But the
set of
fundamental,
laws.
so the way the physicist thinks about it is that Schrodinger's law describes the evolution of the quantum mechanical
Right.
wave function, and whatever else might turn out to be true as the quantum state evolves, Schrodinger's law will still describe how the quantum state evolves.
Right.
End of the day, you're denying it, if I understand.
Yes, I think so.
You'd say, here's an interesting thing. We're not going to get, this is a big discussion,
Right.
but people are interested in it. So Sean Carroll has something he calls the core theory, in which he gives all sorts of arguments why this is an incredibly impossible view to really work out. It's a long distance thing. If anybody's interested in it, there was just one of these things called mind chats, in which they were screaming and yelling by people. I did all my screaming and yelling on that thing, so I'm not going to do it now. But Sean is much clearer than me.
Now, you're persuaded by Sean on this
I
point?
think I persuaded him too.
Oh,
We
okay.
just persuaded each other. Absolutely. I think this is really good. That the part that you said that I really agree with is that when you were talking to Carlo, is that nothing any scientist will discover will answer the kinds of questions about consciousness that you're talking about. But I don't draw the same conclusion that you draw.
Can I just follow up very quickly? Because Brian McLaughlin, for example, has in his article that I mentioned yesterday, talks about Schrodinger's equation and whether strongly emergent phenomena would somehow involve a violation. It's not, and it wouldn't any more than the discovery of a new fundamental force would have violated F=ma. So they're just.
It's not just Schrodinger's equation. Schrodinger's equation together with what's called the strong law, together with Schrodinger's equation together with what the quantum fields are. So it's a combination of those two things.
Yeah, I think I have to say, Becky's wrong.
Who's wrong?
You'd have to say Carol's wrong about that.
Who's going to say that? Tim, I do think you'd say that. I was just saying to
I think
Tim.
Sean's wrong
that
about
he
a lot of
should-
things,
so
I'm not surprised.
I don't know about that, but you're on the side of Phil Goff, if that makes you feel better about this.
He's a Penn site.
He's everything. Yes, but here's what I just want to say. I wanted to just ask Jess a question. Do you think your talk's going to be long, particularly long?
Well, sorry.
Here's what I'm saying
My
is,
section?
the video stuff has to go away at 6. So it gave you an hour and a half if you started 5 minutes from now, but,
Yeah, no, I withdraw my question.
or we could just,
No, it's
or
fine.
we could stick around without the video equipment
I
afterwards.
don't
and
have
just-
any video. I've got a handout.
But they.
No,
No,
we're gonna have to come and drag it away.
Yeah,
and-
of course, the people on-
But,
Do you
okay,
need
so why
to
don't we,
question?
No, I'll talk to Tim.
okay, okay, so we can, or later, we could go to dinner and stuff. Okay,
Some
so
of us
why-
came just for Jessica.
Yeah.
Somebody said something?
Some people came just.
Came just for
Jessica.
Jessica. She's like the main act. And you want to cut into
Jessica
it.
is a main act, there's no doubt about that.
She's the
So we're gonna have a 5-minute break. It's now 4:34. At 4:40, the main event will take place.
All right.
Mind shot. I'm not sure if there's more. Like, yes, it's online. It's a meeting. I'm sure there's something going on and on about it. It's because even during your talk, I got 2 emails.
Okay, so I mean, let me ask this very methodological. So very general question. You tell me whether in effect he's the naive, and this is the hard part, right? Did I take everything away that I like? Let me get that out of you. Yeah, I think you're good to go. I mean, I just stuck this here.
You know, and
It's like, okay, why do we have confidence that the ratings?
and
It comes from the sum total of our.
not it was there they are.
Evidence, right? The evidence is generated from kinds of factors. Assertive. The kinds of the macroscopically interesting kinds of contexts where one might think limits. And so then, you know, like, so it seems like you're ascribing to physics itself. Not just ambitions, but
Let me just
that
say,
the laws.
it's not a commitment of physics.
That it's complete, you know.
Yes,
In
it's not a commitment, it's not a commitment, it's rather an observation about the physics that's been discovered that governs the fundamental stuff. You got to understand what that commitment is, it's the locality and what the fundamental fields are, or other forces.
Okay, so you're saying the specific content of the theory is such that
It's not, in other words, it would require a violation. That's something about my logic, or anything articulate that out. But the violation required would be such that it should have shown up. Okay, because it would have to be violation of discovered in the energy levels that we existed. So that's Sean's argument. Also, the other argument is, which is another.
So this is good. This is an argument I have to.
Okay, which is another. I mean,
I'm
sorry we haven't.
This is a great.
Yeah, I'm sorry we haven't spoken more here because you get the most out of talking to somebody else. Okay. So the other thing is that I don't think you think about this kind of thing is exactly how these new features operate. They operate locally. If they're not local, they're going to run into trouble. If they are local.
Oh, but I'm sorry, do you mean by local? Local.
Like right at that point, at a point, all the fields are. And so I think, I don't know, when you're saying to Carlo, tell me a theory. Now, I do think that there are predictions about macroscopic behavior, really behavior that work out pretty well. They've done before elections. But
these are statistical generalizations over populations.
well, they're statistical, but that's the way, but I don't argue that. I wouldn't want to make a difference. Is of course, that's right. Nobody has figured out psychological laws or anything of this sort. These kind of things. But you haven't really given any models. So if I were, I could just think this way. And that I do think it'd be a very interesting thing. I don't think it's about the logic that the emergent properties. I don't think strong emergent is full.
We need a better understanding of the basic machinery of the brain before you could even do that. What you're looking for.
For your doing,
Yeah.
Just a model of how an emergent force property might work. Forget about the brain.
In which terms you're wanting a kind of fundamental.
I want it to be emergent.
energetic.
No, I just want it to be emergent to make a difference. How fundamental physics says here's some things will evolve. This says, no, when things get that complicated, it's do whatever is there, and it makes the
Interacts with the
and then
fundamental
it
stuff.
interacts and makes so nice. It's a model of that. How that interaction.
So what level, I mean, I'm just wondering how abstract.
So, for example, it might have turned out to be the case that when elementary particles got into the shape, that a student started singing. Now, that would violate, let's say, shocking. That
doesn't, but what I'm talking about. Singing water bottles, I can get you.
But so, okay, so I shouldn't have brought that in because that just. But
the reason you're saying that doesn't violate the law.
So I want you to say,
Because that could still be a matter of microphysical outworking.
right, this is the shape of a body. Yes, so this is what you should do. And you should, if you're interested, if you send me an email, you go long, you change back. You know, except for the fact that I'm sure I'd be embarrassed if I ever was. It is on. Okay, see, you talk to you later. Other thing.
What's your
Oh, yeah. About power. I don't know. There's the fundamental, whatever. There's a holistic thing.
Yeah, well, the gesture is by talking about defining in terms of not as a characteristic function.
This is contributing to. So you know, so Peter doesn't want you to touch. What is wrong with
well, first of all, I wanted to say I am flirting with the idea that one.
But I only have one.
Yeah, I don't have many either.
Well, she might be.
Well, I should be able to just do it. You just.
I don't know what that.
But yeah, I didn't know how to do
Powers. I don't know what they have to do with the other things. Here's what happened.
The idea is to have
And says these aren't valid strips. And then I kind of think. Yeah.
measurable
What is it? It's not in there. That's just not in there. But there is a real standard.
Yeah, that's actually. But it's, I got to do it nicely, but yeah. I just want to wait.
Very good. You might be able to tell you.
This is on the stage. Describing state of that system, which has such a feature. It's the quantum state. If you want to look at it, this is great. I agree with you. He's a medical but on this aspect, he's right about the state. And another person, Emergence. The quantum state. The other person serious stable. Field. It's a field of and Tim, who has a, I don't know, but I think you said that. I just say to him, point out that there's no God, what's going on here. He says, be really happy. So when he becomes Maybe. Or so, I mean, I said divide it. 1 minute.
Yeah, sorry, we should.
Divide the word left. Means governors and powers. With the idea that the laws replace the American. And my view, which is a sort of law. So I divided it up. So the objections I made.
Was he using
I don't think it's close. But if we sit next to each other at dinner.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the contrary, the more people outside that you can yell.
Go get them, Jessica.
Thanks for teaming me up.
Oh, it's so.
Okay, so next and last, as we say, that's for last, and it was called the main event. So as I remember, the main event was like Frazier versus Ali, right? That's the one where there was really people getting knocked out. Whether we're too tired by the end of it.
Thrilla in Manila.
So anyway, Jessica's come all the way from up north to visit us down here. Very glad. She's always extremely interesting to read.
Thanks so much. I want to start though first by thanking Barry and Diego for so much work and I got a ton out of it, and yeah, my mind is buzzing with possible papers. You know, fun fact about Ali and Jamal. I got a million of them. Right around the corner from where we live in Toronto, Bench and I live, on Ossington Avenue, there was a gym, Sully's Gym, where Ali basically went to Toronto at a certain point because of the draft issue, and he fought George Chuvalo at this gym. And of course, now it was turned down and turned into luxury condos. But as a member of the community association, I and others made it the case that there's now a plaque. So that's something. Yeah, so as I was just saying, Tim, thanks for teeing me up here for the wild and wacky portion of the conference. So what I want to do here basically is offer us a précis of one of the chapters of my book, Metaphysical Emergence, in which, you know, I go into a lot more detail about the things I'm going to say today. So, you know, I recommend that to people who would like to hear more of the gory details. But here's the basic idea. Metaphysical emergence, as I'm understanding it, couples cotemporal dependence, and by cotemporal, what I mean is something like broadly synchronic. So synchronic, I use cotemporal instead of synchronic because synchronic often is taken as instantaneous, and that's not necessarily what's at issue here. In metaphysical emergence, it could be temporally extended goings on. It couples cotemporal dependence of some goings on lower level configurations across that temporal expanse and their features with higher level distinctness and distinctive efficacy. So I sometimes put that as ontological and causal autonomy, but all it really means is distinctness and distinctive efficacy. So in this book, I defend the viability of two schemas for such emergence. One is weak in the sense that it's compatible with physicalism on the supposition that's often operative in these debates, that the compositionally basic goings on are physical. And one is strong, which is not so compatible on that assumption. And I consider, after defending the viability of these schemas, which I'll put on the table shortly, for a range of phenomena, whether they might be, in fact, weakly or strongly emergent. And those are complex systems, ordinary objects, consciousness, and then free will as the final chapter. And so here I want to talk, as I said, about my reasons for thinking that actually we can make out good cases that there is emergent free will of both weak and strong varieties. So that's kind of fun, I think. So let me say a little bit more about metaphysical emergence and put the schemas on the table. Why are we interested in this, and what's the target phenomena or the data that we're trying to capture or accommodate in giving an account of metaphysical emergence? Well, as I'm stipulating it to be, and as it is usually taken to be, it's motivated by appearances which suggest that, in the first instance, special science, focus on the sciences, special science entities and their characteristic features co-temporally depend on, and yet to some extent are ontologically and causally autonomous from, distinct and distinctly efficacious as compared to the lower level, ultimately physical configurations and their features upon which they depend. So there are a bunch of different motivations for these sort of, as I put it, broadly pre-theoretic appearances. Scientific consensus, for example, according to which scientists standardly assume that the only matter or substance is physical matter or substance, and that the features of special science entities are to some extent functionally dependent on or generated by the features of lower level physical configurations. There's also the special sciences themselves, which seem to involve distinctive taxonomies, distinctive kinds, cells, persons, and gases, etc., and features which are on the face of it different from the kinds that are posited in the fundamental physical sciences, and the laws that are associated with these special sciences that are understood as treating or governing these special scientific goings-on are on the face of it different in various respects. Typically, they're more abstract or they're restricted to certain contexts. So there are good reasons for thinking that they are different. But again, not floating free in the way that might be the case if something like Cartesian dualism was true. There's universal properties and behaviors. So for example, thermodynamic systems, complex systems near critical points exhibit universal behaviors, features and behaviors across widely or wildly diverse micro configurations. Perceptual unity, I think, is an interesting one. I mean, of course, there's deflationary understandings of our experience here, but on the face of it, it seems that macro objects, they have a kind of perceptual unity. We don't experience them as a buzzing array of fundamental physical fields or particles and so on. And then I think there's also the consideration, another consideration which I think is quite interesting, is compositional flexibility, according to which macro objects or special science goings on in particular seem not to depend for their existence and persistence over time on any specific micro configuration. So again, there's dependence and yet a certain kind of ontological and causal, potentially as associated with special science laws and so on, causal autonomy that's associated with special science entities and features, but more generally also, or maybe less generally, macro objects and their features of ordinary dry goods of our experience. So just to make a couple of clarifications and flag a couple of assumptions, metaphysical emergence or whatever type of emergence is not the only strategy for making sense of these appearances of later structure. I mean, there are deflationary approaches to the entire batch of appearances. For example, the reductionist one-level views. There's also substance dualist or substance pluralist views, which would also in some sense accommodate later structure. But what's distinctive about metaphysical emergence as a way of trying to accommodate these appearances is that it aims to realistically do so in a way, non-deflationary way, make sense of higher level reality in a way that is compatible with physical or material monism. So in that sense, the emergentist approaches are, I think, following up a little bit on this question of naturalism, they are more naturalistically acceptable than, say, a substance dualist or pluralist view, insofar as they are, committed to, as I understand it, there being a kind of dependence which needs to be cashed out on the lower level, broadly physical goings on. Okay. It's also typically assumed that whatever is going on in these cases, emergent phenomena require and are at least nomologically necessitated by, or as I sometimes put it, minimally supervene on or minimally nomologically supervene on the cotemporal base level goings on. So there's a kind of, there's correlations associated with supervenience of the sort that Brian's talked about. Great, in very illuminating ways. Minimal supervenience is also useful for sort of encoding that the target conceptions of emergence here don't aim to encode the uninteresting fact. I don't know, maybe it's not uninteresting, but it's not the one that we're interested in here, that wholes, WHOLES, typically have properties that their individual parts don't have. Of course, that's the case. But what we're specifically looking at, what I'm looking at in my book in particular, targeting is kind of, in general, what's considered, could be, I think, considered a one-to-one relation between certain higher level goings on and a lower level, and one higher level instantiation and one lower level instantiation, one higher level object, one lower level configuration, and so on, with the focus typically being on the emergence of features from features of configurations, maybe they're pluralities, maybe they're relational aggregates. But you can see that, like, the assumption of minimal nomological supervenience, makes it the case that you need to have the configuration there. It's the configuration that necessitates, at least nomologically, the emergent. An individual, entity or its feature would not do that modal work. Okay. So now, what's the primary challenge to taking these appearances of leveled structure at face value? I think Kim's concerns about causal overdetermination are really, they impose the most pressure. Of course, there's other considerations as well, parsimony and so on. But when I look at Kim's argument, and I imagine that most of you will be familiar with this, I'll say a little bit more about overdetermination concerns down the line. But I argue, and again, I'm just going to gloss this for now, that there's two and only two strategies of response that will preserve the pre-theoretic appearances of metaphysical emergence in a way that resolves Kim's concerns. Okay, so one of these is associated with the British emergentists, according to which some cotemporally dependent higher level features have fundamentally novel powers that are not had or not had in the same way by their base features. So again, I'm going to focus in what follows on features for the most part. So in that case, there's no overdetermination. The concern about overdetermination being that if some higher level entity causes some effect, but it depends on some lower level physical goings on, and the lower level physical goings on, can't they boss around everything? Don't they also produce that effect? There's going to be overdetermination. For the British emergentists, the answer is, well, actually the physical goings on, they can be like necessary preconditions for the coming into play of the strong emergent, but they themselves don't do some work. There's some causal work that the strongly emergent goings on, you need them around to do this work. They're in some sense, as Tim was saying, they're sort of fundamentally novel powers that are configurationally dependent, but again, do work that the physical goings on don't do except in virtue of bringing about the strong emergent, which really has the power. That's one kind of strategy. Another strategy is the non-reductive physicalist strategy. There's a whole bunch of different approaches to non-reductive physicalism, appealing to different relations between higher level and lower level goings on, functionalist accounts, functional realization accounts, Diablo's determinable determinate approach, constitutive mechanism accounts, etc. according to these, but I argue that these approaches, seemingly diverse, have in common that they take some cotemporally dependent features to have a proper subset of the powers that are had by the base level features. So in that case, there's overdetermination in the sense that when a power gets exercised by the higher level feature, it is also a power of the lower level feature, and that, you know, it's one and the same power actually, because it's there's token identity as regards the instantiations of these features. So there is overdetermination in a sense, but it's not problematic. Only one power is being exercised, even if you want to say there's two causes. So these two approaches, one British emergentist approach, and again, I have to thank Brian for you know, doing the good work of initially making strong emergentism, a lot of the British emergentists kind of, you know, philosophically, you know, showing that that's a philosophically interesting and coherent position. So this is strong emergence, and here on the handout, what it is for a token feature S to be strongly metaphysically emergent from some token feature P on a given occasion. It's for it to be the case on that occasion that S cotemporally materially depends on P, where that just kind of registers this assumption of material monism, and that S has at least one token power not identical with any token power of P. Note, by the way, that doesn't mean S has all the other powers of P. It's just there's at least one new. I mean, whether or not S and P share any powers is open on this account, but S has at least one that P doesn't have, or doesn't have except in virtue of bringing about S. That's the strong emergence schema. The weak emergence schema is the same, except with respect to the second condition, S, instead of having a new power that the P feature P does not have, has a non-empty proper subset of the token powers had by P. So let me just say a couple of things about these schemas. Again, the first condition is pretty neutrally expressed with respect to this idea of cotemporal material dependence. It's, you know, encoding minimal nomological supervenience and the supposition of material or physical monism. But the real action is with respect to the second condition, because that's the condition that's doing the work of gaining distinctness and distinctive efficacy. So for strong emergence, that's really straightforward. If you've got a new power, then by Leibniz's law, you're different. And, you know, the new power is clearly such as to render you distinctively efficacious. Now with weak emergence, it's a little trickier because every token power of the weak emergent is, you know, identical, strictly identical with the power of its physical base feature. But I argue if we look at the distinctive power profile, and this is the usefulness of the non-empty proper subset approach to realization in this case, you can make out that the weak emergent can be distinctively efficacious, not in virtue of having a new power, but in having a distinctive power profile, as I put it. And that serves as a kind of distinctive efficacy in that that distinctive profile can be sensitive to difference-making considerations or comparatively abstract levels of grain. So it doesn't, you know, include microphysical details, et cetera, and can be sensitive to difference-making considerations. And this is something that I want to thank Barry for in a couple of papers, before and lower, that are making mine matter more papers. Making mine matter and more, yet more papers, kind of highlighting how difference-making considerations could enter into higher level autonomy. So the base feature, again, is a feature of a configuration. And so the satisfaction of the second condition has to be understood accordingly. And, you know, I argue that implementing these schemas doesn't require any heavyweight notion of power. So talk of powers is just going to be shorthand for talk what causal contributions the possession of a given feature makes or can make relative to the same laws of nature to an entity's bringing about an effect when in certain circumstances. I argue that even a contingentist, categoricalist Humean can make sense of powers in the way that's needed for implementing these schemas. The idea would just be that there's overlapping regularities or something like that. I also think that the schemas, the notions of causation that underlie the schemas appeal to powers. You know, I'm not building in anything about, dispositions, essentiality to features or anything like that. I will say, though, I will flag this for the physicists to hammer me about later on. I am presupposing, following the vast number of people, working in this neck of the woods, who, are physicalists and accept physical causal closure and so on, that the notion of physical causation is in good standing for all anyone has shown, in particular Russell. Happy to talk about that later. So now I want to turn to free will, and what I am going to argue is a kind of interesting generalization of Kim's problem and Horgan's extension of Kim's problem of mental causation or higher level causation to what Horgan called the problem of mental causation. So first, free will, as I'm understanding it here, if such there be, and I do think there is such, it involves, I'm assuming, free choosing, the ability to choose an outcome, which would be either an intention to phi for some phi, or it might be the phi-ing itself, where the outcome is free in being, in some substantive sense, up to the agent of the choice. So that's how I'm understanding free will, as free choosing in this way. In our 2016 paper, Sarah Bernstein and I argue that the problems of free will and of mental causation can be seen as special cases of a more general problem. Again, we are generalizing what Horgan calls the problem of mental causation. It's something Barry has also written on. The problem of mental causation, as initially expressed by Kim, sometimes pitched as the problem of how you can have a qualitative mental feature or an intentional mental feature, M. How could it be efficacious at all, given something basically physical causal closure, given that any effect it might purportedly cause is, by closure, already caused by the physical feature P upon which M depends. So that's how it's sometimes pitched. But of course, there's an easy way to gain the mental events or properties efficacy. Why not just identify M with P? But as Horgan points out, that leaves open the deeper question, or doesn't really resolve the problem. It sort of shifts it to the question of, well, look, we wanted the mental goings on to be efficacious, qua mental, qua the type of mental event that they are, not just in virtue of being identical to a physical event. So here's the expression of this problem of mental causation. How could an intentional or qualitative mental feature M be efficacious qua intentional or qualitative vis-a-vis an effect E, given that, as per physical causal closure, E was already caused by the physical P upon which M depends, in ways that seem to preclude M's being efficacious in such a respect. So that's the problem of mental causation that Horgan flags. And in our view, in Sarah's and my view, a similar problem of mental causation lies at the core of the consequence argument. Of course, Peter's foundational work on this is relevant, or what you could just call the problem of free will. In the free will debates now, of course, that events of choosing are efficacious is typically taken for granted. So that's not the sense in which there's a parallel between the problems. Rather, and here I'm going to be looking at a version of causal determinism and sort of interpreting the consequence argument in that, as appealing to causal determinism as opposed to determinism as involving entailment. What is at issue is whether events of free choosing can be efficacious qua free, maybe I should say, because it's causation, I should say qua, being inconsistent, qua free given causal determinism. So how could a mental choosing M be efficacious vis-a-vis an effect E in virtue of, or qua free, given that, as per causal determinism, E was causally determined by laws of nature and events antecedent to M in ways that seem to preclude M's being efficacious in such a respect. So you can see the parallel there. it doesn't show up if you just think about the problem of mental causation. And it certainly doesn't show up if you're just thinking about, would there be a consequence argument associated with the dependence on the physical? No. But if you look at things through the right, if you squint at it through the right lens, I think then you can see that there's a similar pattern here. So this is what we suggest. These problematics are specific cases or instances of a suitably general problem of mental causation. How can a mental feature M of a given type, qualitative, intentional, free, be efficacious vis-a-vis an effect E in virtue of being the type of mental event it is, given reason to think that features of M's type are causally irrelevant to the production of events of E's type? So that's by way of setup that of there being a kind of parallel between these different problematics, which is interestingly, I think underappreciated that there is such a parallel. One thing I'm hoping is by talking about this in this context is I feel like our paper sort of felt stillborn from the press. And, I think there's a lot of, useful philosophical ore to be mined from appreciating this parallel. And a couple of them, a couple nuggets I'm hoping to put on the table today. So if there is a parallel between these problematics of this sort, you might think, well, maybe certain positions that are offered as responses to the problematics can themselves, they can illuminate each other. And in our paper, we argue that compatibilism should be seen as relevantly similar to non-reductive physicalism. And then here I'm going to also argue that libertarianism can be seen as parallel to strong emergence of the sort that is captured in the schema. So let's first talk about compatibilism. Hawthorne and Pettit, we kind of use that their taxonomy of compatibilist views as framing our discussion. So here I'm still talking about Sarah and Mike's paper. They say all compatibilists agree that every choice has antecedents and that this fact puts freedom of choice in doubt. How can a choice be made freely if it's the product of independent antecedents? The response they make is that some possible antecedents are better than others from the point of view of free choice, and that a choice is free to the extent that its antecedents, or, and importantly, at least its relevant antecedents, satisfy the inherently vague condition of leaving it up to the agent, unquote. So in schematic form, X chooses freely to phi, if and only if the relevant antecedents of the choice leave the phi up to X. So this is the general schema for compatibilism. Okay, and the choice to phi might be either an intention to phi or a phi. And the three compatibilist accounts that they discuss and that we treat of what it would be for a choice to be up to an agent are associated with notions of freedom as underdetermination, as ownership, and as responsibility. So each of those accounts, compatibilist accounts, sort of gesture towards or discuss different sets of relevant antecedents that are crucial in their view for making the case that the choice would be up to the agent. So here I'm just going to look at the case of freedom as underdetermination. And here I'm going to argue that this account plausibly imposes satisfaction of a certain proper subset condition as key to the operative response to the problem of free will. But we, as I say, we do this in our paper for the other compatibilist accounts as well. So now on these underdetermination accounts, a choice to phi is the result of a free choosing M, just in case M could have resulted in a choice not to phi. Okay, but how could this be, given that the choice to phi was determined as per condition that I deleted? But the causal antecedents condition encoding causal determinism is one that says that, given the entire set of antecedents, the outcome of the choosing was completely determined. The underdetermination approach proceeds by identifying a subset C of the causal antecedents of the choice to phi, relative to which it was left open whether or not M would result in a choice to phi. So as Hawthorne and Pettit put it, taken as a whole, the antecedents of any choice, total antecedents, will necessitate that choice under a deterministic picture, and compatibilists of this stripe must take the relevant antecedents to be a subset of the totality. But which subset? The relevant subset of antecedent events will typically include the choosing event, along with events tracking standing beliefs and desires of the agent at the time of choosing, and events tracking whether the choosing took place under conditions of physical restraint and threat, et cetera. And so this is actually, I thought Carlo was picking out some of those kinds of considerations when, you know, you talk about not being forced to do it, you were didn't have your hands tied behind your back and so on. Okay, so from broader perspectives, the relevant antecedents might also include events tracking cultural influences, past trauma, other psychological, social, psychiatric, neurological conditions holding up agent. So the line is going to be that an agent is free to the extent that the antecedents that can or have to be countenanced in that perspective, right, the underdetermination perspective, leave the choice underdetermined. Okay, to be free, if you like, is to be free relative to that stance, relative to these considerations that are tracking whether you are forced, brainwashed, and so on. Okay, so here, crucially, I think, the relevant antecedent events must be a proper subset of the causal antecedents which determine the choice if the relevant antecedents are to leave the choice underdetermined. That subset of relevant antecedents, the subset of relevant antecedents leaves the choice underdetermined entails, and this is the crucial, I think, core of a compatibilist strategy, entails that it is possible that a choosing M prime of the same type as M occur, having relevant antecedents C prime of the same type as M's relevant antecedent C, this proper subset, but where the total antecedents of M prime are such as to completely determine a different outcome. So if M initially, by its total causal antecedents, was determined to a choice to phi, then this C prime alternative total causal antecedents, which contain as a proper subset M prime, which is the same type as the relevant antecedents M, C prime relevant, same type as relevant antecedent C of M, then in that hypothetical case, the M prime will produce a choice not to phi, or the absence of a choice to phi, either way. Okay, so this is, I think, a nice way to understand what's going on this approach. But notice crucially that it implements a proper subset strategy, characterizing a mental choosing M as associated with a proper subset of its causal antecedents, and then using this association to accommodate M's being distinctively efficacious, qua free, vis-a-vis the ensuing choice. Okay, so that's what we argued in our paper. And in my book, I tried to carry it a bit further and say, not only is there a kind of structural parallel where the compatibilists are appealing to something like a proper subset strategy that appeals to causal antecedents, and the non-reductive physicalist is appealing to a proper subset strategy that appeals to a proper subset of token powers, you can actually deepen the parallel and massage the compatibilist strategy into the exact form that's operative in the schema for weak emergence. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, basically what you're going to do is consider these causal antecedents and the proper subset of relevant causal antecedents as big complex events. We're going to associate powers with those events, and then observe that in fact, on this strategy, you're going to end up with those events have being such that the free choosing, properly understood, the free choosing understood as associated with the relevant antecedents, has a proper subset of the token powers of the complete, well, the yet more complex event that encodes the entire set of causal antecedents. So every token, I've got this on the handout, and I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to read that out. But my sense there, what I argue in the book, is that there's no in principle problem with assigning powers to these temporally extended complex events. We do it all the time in the special sciences, and under the circumstances that this strategy that I just went over can be seen as, in fact, implementing not just a proper subset of antecedents vis-a-vis the total set of antecedents, but just put it in terms of powers, then we have basically another instance of the schema for weak emergence, and well, along with the supposition that we have cotemporal material dependence, which the compatibilist is going to be happy to allow. So this is kind of cool, I think, this result, because it provides a new response to the concern with the compatibilist strategy that identifying a subset of the causal antecedents is not going to make sense of free choosing, because, you know, the mere presence of a subset of antecedents doesn't establish that M selects or determines the outcome. But here again, the compatibilists can help themselves to the non-reductive physicalist line of thought here in establishing the distinctive efficacy of weak emergence. They will grant that M's distinctive efficacy, the efficacy associated with the choosing, doesn't proceed via the having of a distinctive power, just as physical causal closure would block taking a qualitative or intentional mental event or feature to have a new power. So does causal compatibilism block taking a choosing M to have a new power. That would be libertarianism, not compatibilism. But the compatibilists, like the non-reductive physicalists, can maintain that even in the absence of new powers to select or determine outcomes, M, a choosing, may be distinctively efficacious vis-a-vis those outcomes in tracking difference-making considerations, for example. So if the causal antecedents of my choice had been slightly different, I would still have chosen as I did, or as tracking a distinctive psychological level of causal rank. Okay, let me quickly talk about the parallel between libertarianism and strong emergence. This is pretty obvious because in both cases you have, commitment to some kind of fundamentally novel power. Here I talk about agent causal libertarian accounts of the sort that Tim has nicely developed. Again, there's other approaches to libertarian accounts falling under non-causal event causal varieties in addition to the agent causal varieties. Again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip over this and observe that it's pretty clear. I'm going to read Tim's quotation, though, at the bottom of page 5, that Tim is very much committed to the posit of such a power, and to its being able to be understood in terms of emergence. We may suppose that such powers are ontologically emergent powers, ones that are at once causally dependent on microphysically based structural states and yet ontologically primitive, and so apt to confer ontologically primitive causal power. And what is this power at issue? Well, it's one that allows one to choose to act or to intend to act in one way rather than another. And this is also Tim. Agent causation is precisely the power to directly determine which of several causal possibilities is realized on a given occasion. The view posits a fundamental irreducible power of agents to form intentions. So Tim's version of libertarianism clearly satisfies the conditions in the schema for strong emergence. Modulo this question of whether the dependence is causal or just involves a kind of cotemporal dependence, which I argued we can massage your account into that form. So I've got the parallels on the table now, and I want to use them to explore whether there is any compatibilist or libertarian free will. And again, as far as compatibilist free will, I think I can be brief. Compatibilism manifests the weak emergentist characterization of special science goings on as comparatively insensitive to microphysical details, in that an agent's reasons for action in a given case float free of many of those details. In particular, are sensitive only to facts about the relevant causal antecedents, and maybe not even sensitive in any kind of fine-grained way to that subset of causal antecedents. So since our deliberations and associated acts of choice clearly are insensitive to many microphysical details, there's good reason to think that compatibilist free will actually exists, and moreover, there's plenty of it. There's tons of it. It's all over. Okay, good. Now, what about libertarian free will? Free will of a strongly emergent variety. Look, many people think, and I am inclined to agree, that compatibilist accounts fail to accommodate the core phenomenal and intentional aspects of free will, whereby a freely choosing agent feels from the inside to be causally determinative in a way transcending any nomological goings on, deterministic or indeterministic. This is my take on it anyway. I think Tim, when he's referring to, so you talk about the phenomenological aspects and so on as being very important. And I agree with you that for purposes of motivating libertarian free will, as opposed to compatibilist free will, the phenomenology is really, that's the one of the most pressing points of difference here. I mean, the distinctive efficacy that's associated with insensitivity to certain antecedent micro-level details is just not of the transcendent variety at issue in our experience of agency. It's distinctive efficacy, so that's all good, but it's not nomologically transcendent efficacy. So if we really want to try to accommodate that, what seems required is that the associated acts of free choosing involve a fundamentally novel power which transcends any nomological net. And when I say transcends any nomological net, I don't mean to say that there couldn't be these vertical laws, for example, saying that you need such and such complex configurations of perhaps brain level goings on in order for this fundamentally novel interaction or power to kick in. So there's that kind of thing. There'll also be maybe certain kinds of regularities associated with the ability of outcomes of free choosing to impact lower level and even ultimately fundamental physical goings on. So it's not nomologically transcendent across the board, but the choice itself, I'm suggesting, from the inside is nomologically transcendent. And to just follow up on your response to my question about laws and so on, I feel like in the first instance, what free choice involves is not necessarily anything morally or ethically or self-constituting or any morally or ethically loaded or self-constituting or self-willing or anything like that. It just involves choice. And it can be just this question: should I drop this or not? What's it gonna be? I didn't. Okay, so in the first instance, those sorts of things, I don't necessarily feel like I have any disposition that could serve as the basis of some sort of even probabilistic statistical generalities. Sometimes I throw the chalk in the air, sometimes I don't. The other aspects that do enter into more heavyweight kinds of choosings, maybe that those are independent sorts of considerations that then combine with this primitive ability to freely choose to, and maybe when you beef up the content of the decisions and so and the deliberations and so on, maybe you can start to get some statistical regularities or even laws, I don't know. But in general, I want to, I just gonna stick with my characterization of libertarian free will as involving nomologically transcendent choice. Okay. So is there any such free will so transcendently understood in my book and elsewhere, I've argued that one way to kind of make sense of the naturalistic acceptability of strong emergence is by looking at some historical scientific case studies where, when was it that we posited a new fundamental interaction? And, historically, now this is not the story that people are going to, the scientists have moved beyond this, but initially with, for example, beta decay, there were these seeming violations of conservation laws. And then you face a choice. Do we give up the conservation law or do we posit some new fundamental interaction and associated particles or whatever is carrying away the energy? And interestingly, that case is a case involving a nucleus, which is a complex entity. So if that just seems to me like a good case for thinking that scientists have no in principle problem with fundamental configurational forces of the sort that Brian discusses, vis-a-vis the British emergentists. Now, are there these sort of fundamental configurational forces at the level of the brain? We are not in position to test empirically, but that's a practical consideration. If we, had massively greater compositional resources, or maybe we can do it for simpler creatures and so on. I've actually had a scientist suggest maybe we should try to get together and experiment with some kind of lobster or something, I don't know, and check out, is there in fact a violation of conservation law? If so, just as in the case of the weak nuclear interaction, as it was initially characterized as a new fundamental interaction, then that would be indicative of perhaps there being a fundamental mental interaction associated with free choosings and so on. And the same would be true for intentional and qualitative mental states as well. Now that's very speculative. Right now, we're not in a position to perform that experiment. But I think in the case of free will, because it's nomologically transcendent of libertarian free will, there's a different route to thinking that we do in fact have it. And it just goes by the simple argument, according to which, first, we experience ourselves as seeming to freely choose in ways that are nomologically transcendent, whether deterministically or indeterministically. In the absence of good reasons to think that our experience of nomologically transcendent free will cannot be taken at face value, we're entitled to take this experience at face value. Why not? I mean, we have it's data, it's introspective experience. On the face of it, for example, seems like I'm having introspective experience. There are certain colors in the room, etc. I could take that experience as face value, unless somebody gives me reason to think I can't. So the third premise then would be that there are no good reasons to think that our experience, and here I should have also said, of nomologically transcendent free will, there's no good reason to think that that experience cannot be taken at face value. And the conclusion is that we're entitled to take our experience of nomologically transcendent free will at face value. And given that I've connected libertarian free will of this variety to strong emergence, and that it would follow that there is strong emergent free will. Okay, so what's the main potential concern with this argument? I think it lies in premise 3, according to which Libet and other cases, neurophysicists, neurologists, and so on, might be thought to have, provided us reasons for it to mean that we cannot take our experience at face value. So, for example, Crusoe advocates that sort of line, acknowledging that there's a phenomenology is present. So Crusoe's an incompatibilist, but he grants, like most do, that we do have this seeming experience of transcendent free will. But unfortunately, he says, we can't stick with that because neuroscience has shown that that's an illusion. Tim has written a whole bunch on this, and I will be appealing to some of his conclusions here, but there are other sorts of cases, but here I'm just going to focus on the Libet cases, which are typically thought to be the most pressing. But yeah, if there are other cases that need to be considered, I'd be happy to hear about them. So what are these Libet cases? In this footnote, this is how O'Connor describes it. People are asked to wiggle their finger within a short interval of time. The instructor, experimenter instructs them to do so whenever they wish, though spontaneously, not by deciding the moment in advance. They watch a special clock. They note its location at the precise moment when they felt the urge to move their finger. During the experiment, a device measures electrical activity on their scalp, and Libet discovered that a steady increase in this activity, which is called the readiness potential, consistently preceded the time that the agent cited when they experienced the will to move, so to speak. So he and others concluded from this result that conscious will is not the initiator of the voluntary acting, but instead a consequence of some unconscious physical process, which does so. Okay, but now, is it really true that studies of this sort establish that transcendently free will is an illusion? Well, I don't think so. I mean, there's a bunch of different considerations that alternative interpretations of the experiment that have been put on the table, both by Tim and Alfred Mealy. I'm just going to skip over and I'm going to talk about my contribution to this particular issue, a different interpretation, which I think is usefully motivated by attention to strong emergence or metaphysical emergence in general. And on this interpretation, the idea is that the intention to choose and the brain activity are cotemporally initiated, but it takes a little time for this fact to register as a complete thought in the agent's mind. So thinking takes time, more time perhaps than a choice. A very small lag, less than half a second, would be a natural concomitant of our mental decision-making processes, compatible with transcendent free will. So the idea is that the readiness potential is not prior to the event of choosing, but it's rather part of a temporally extended dependent space for the act of choosing, okay? And here the fact that in looking at cases of metaphysical emergence, we're often looking at temporally extended dependent spaces and the associated emergent features, I think is useful because Libet seems to have in mind something that I think is overly simple or simplistic, according to which, nomologically transcendent free will would, work instantaneously or something like that. But there's no reason to think that would be the case if it's in fact metaphysically emergent. It would just be perfectly compatible with transcendent free will that it required a temporally extended dependent space like that. So that's one interpretation. There's about 14 other kinds of candidates, a couple I put on the handout, but the upshot is that the Libet cases can be resisted as discrediting our experience. So absent other reasons to discredit this experience, we're entitled to conclude that there is free will of a libertarian, strongly emergent variety. And so to conclude, if we understand compatibilist and libertarian free will, as forms of or instantiating weak and strong emergence, respectively, then that can give us some insight into thinking about, I think, what the proponents of these views really have in mind in their strategies for responding to the consequence argument in particular, can support them being naturalistically acceptable in both cases, given that strong emergence can be seen to be naturalistically acceptable, and also help us determine whether we have any of either of these varieties of free will. And I've argued that, yes, we do have both varieties, weak and strong.
Thanks, Jessica. So such an interesting talk that what if we do this? Maybe they have to return the equipment exactly at 6.
Yeah, I think the super dissonance.
Okay, you just whenever you have to do it. But if it's okay, I think we could give our discussion to go until 6:15 or so. Okay, so I don't think so. So Carolina hasn't said anything.
I did say one thing.
You did,
Some
sorry,
others,
sorry.
yeah. But thank you.
There's a que- and I will go to the line in just a second. Caroline.
I guess I would like to backtrack. No, so back to the very beginning. So why understand the problem of will in the first place as a problem about causal efficacy of anything? And why is it that I, as a compatibilist, have to basically believe, if I'm understanding the proposal, that a choice can be causally efficacious as free or qua free? Why couldn't I just believe that, no, the question is there freedom in deterministic world? I'm sorry, I'm not understanding the motivation of the whole project that takes you to power and the proper class solution, all of that. If I'm not convinced that that is the question in the first place, to me it seems like the question is just what it appears. Is there freedom in a freedom in a deterministic world? Maybe that's a higher level kind of property that doesn't have to have any causal powers. With mental properties, it seems like do want to say perhaps that they're possibly efficacious. Why should I say something similar about free action? Or maybe even about action too, right? So if I move my hand, that has effects in the world. Doesn't matter if it's an action. It might depend on your view, right? If it's just a matter of moving your hand, it could be the result of you're willing to move your hand or not, and it could still have causal effects, maybe the same kinds of causal effects. What is the motivation? Similarly for free action.
Well, the focus just is on free action, not just on anything else but that. Okay, so
But action is the first step, right, towards.
I'm only interested in free choosings, and I'm not not trying to do any further work in distinguishing free choosings from other kinds of actions and so on. I'm just taking for granted that there's this notion of free choosing that's at issue in at least a goodly portion of the debate, and trying to understand that in light of a potential parallel with the problem of mental causation, not though crucially just having to do with whether it's efficacious, but whether it's these free choosings are efficacious qua free. Now, if you don't think they need to be efficacious at all, then I'm not sure you will find this useful strategy for thinking about compatibilism. But I think that my own sense is that many compatibilists and incompatibilists do want our choices to be efficacious and to be distinctively efficacious in some way or another, because after all, in many cases, we're choosing to do something that has important ramifications for who we are and our agency. And we also just want to know, are we totally determined? Are we sort of trapped in the nomological net? Or if we are, is there still a sense in which we have autonomy in this sense, causal autonomy? There's all those considerations which I think are heavily causally loaded. Now, I've tried to be as neutral as I can about the notions of power and causation that are operative. But if, for people who are happy to allow that there might be epiphenomenal mental events and so on, this is not going to speak to them. My own view is that we don't have any reason to think that there are epiphenomenal mental goings on. The best reasons for thinking that there are have to do with Kim-style concerns about causal overdetermination. But if you think that you have a better response to Kim's, which preserves the, their efficacy and in addition to their reality.
I've never even thought about the question of what actions cause choices cause things qua free.
Yeah.
Well,
this is new. This is new. That's why, I know maybe that kind of
Right.
response, explaining why it felt stillborn from the press, but if you
Imagine
try
that-
to think of it.
So imagine
Yeah.
that you believe that choice is free, is something that supervenes and it's having certain causes.
Mhm.
Right, so I believe that. So then you have a similar exclusion problem that arises for, the fact that it's free and the fact that the choice has certain causes. So that's a parallel that I do see might arise. The question about whether they are free in the first place just seems to have to do with the conditions that have to be met for free, nothing to do with causal efficacy. And I don't know if you're thinking of.
Well, it's distinctive efficacy that's crucial, right? So it's, if that's what it seems to me, that the compatibilists who are appealing to some kind of freedom as under determination are trying to make out how it could be that a given choosing would be, in some sense, causally relevant, right? Notwithstanding that it was that, the causal
Can you go over
antecedents
that
taken.
example again? Maybe that would help. I don't know if there's time.
Well, a typical case, I'm not sure what it would be, but the idea would be that the relevant antecedents for this kind of compatibilist would advert to, facts or events that were among the causal antecedents, but a proper subset of them that were kind of the ones that are crucial for determining whether you were, making sure you were not brainwashed and you weren't under duress and psychological imprinting or et cetera. So, picking out those antecedents and saying, well, your action was free in the sense that, your choosing was to do this rather than that. You chose something, right? That's what seems like a causal process in a way, right? You had an intention to phi or you did phi. Those are causal goings on, it seems to me, either one. And you want a sense in which that causal relation was, it mattered that you made that choice, right? Your choice was somehow distinctively efficacious as regards that choice. This strategy
I
of
don't get it. I mean, what I would say about that view is simply they say it's free to the extent that it has, these causes,
Yeah.
not these other causes, and that's it.
Well, I'm talking about the effects as well,
What is
right?
the effect that's different if you do it freely?
Yeah.
What is the effect?
Well, it might be, it could be a choice to phi. Let's say it's a choice to phi. And then the idea is that take the proper subset of relevant antecedents. If those were of the same type of antecedents were supplemented by different, such that the total causal antecedents, right, were different. You look at like basically the complement of the antecedents, they're different across these two cases. And then you end up with a choice to not phi. So that's the actual, what I think is very cool, is it gives you an actual concrete story to tell about how the relevant antecedents, do enter into making it, a plot, there being a plausible story about how, your choice is up to the agent relative to that stance, relative to that proper subset, namely because those same antecedents in a different context could have produced a different choice, compatible with determinism.
So I think we should.
Yeah.
It's an interesting discussion,
Yeah.
but maybe to continue.
But
So
I
there's
just
an
want to
online-
say, let me just say one other thing. I mean, this is unfamiliar territory. I know for people who are working solidly in the free will debate, they might have thought that mental causation and the strategies for resolving the problematics there for specifically mental causation might not be relevant. So all I'm asking from you is to give it a test drive. I'm not saying that you couldn't do without it. People have been doing without it, but here's a strategy for connecting up two debates, and it might be potentially illuminating.
So my cue is an online question to Elle.
Okay.
She still have her hand up there? Elle,
Oh, I'm ready.
Just want
Yeah.
to, let me just announce who's so people keep track. So you, then Peter, then Diego, then, sorry, Jan and Jan, and then John. Is that okay? Is there anybody else? Anybody else can wait?
John can go first.
Okay, John, who's gonna go first?
Ellie.
Ellen's gonna go first.
Elle, you go first. Elle.
Thanks. Thank you, Jessica. That was a really interesting talk. And my question is about this phenomenological experience of free will. It seems to me that the Libet experiments are really confusing about this, because the situation in which Libet asks his subjects to engage in action doesn't seem like the paradigm examples of free will, where you're like sitting at the edge of your bed and you really want to go to the party, but there's COVID outside and you don't want to die. And so you have to override your first order impulses to go out. Like, that's the sort of situation I would have expected free will to emerge in. And that's the sort of situation where I can easily imagine mental states causing other mental states in a way that it just doesn't seem to me that the Libet experiments can replicate. Do you think that causes a problem or has any impact on whether we should be thinking of free will as weakly or strongly emergent? That's my question.
Thank you, Elle. Well, what you were just describing there, interestingly enough, Libet thinks that you do have veto power does show up even in these experiments. So just, connecting that up with something that is, out there in the literature. If you think veto power of the sort that you were just describing is crucial, then actually the Libet cases don't pose a problem for that sort of thing, interestingly enough. But yeah, no, I don't think necessarily that veto power, so whether we're thinking about the choices, positively initiating some action or intention or blocking an action or intention matters for purposes of making sense of free will as strongly emergent in this case. Because
Okay, thanks.
Like the point being just that, having that power to choose, you have the power to either go forth or not. So it could be that you block it, it could be that you're, positively doing something, et cetera. So I'm not, unless you have reason to think that there would be a problem there, I think it could cover that case as well.
Okay. Peter.
Well, as with Tim, I feel like there's this enormous philosophical continent, and I'm on one side of it, you're on the other. So very early on in the paper, you said one of your principal questions is how could a mental event be efficacious? So what is an event? A long time ago, J1 Kim said, well, events are individuated by substance, property, time, triples. Maybe they're not substance, but they're individuated like this. And in that case, I suppose a mental event would be something like a triple Jessica, the property of thinking about the vacation in Paris and now. Probably that's not an event that happens. It's but that doesn't sound like the kind of thing that could be causally efficacious to me. I mean, you acquire this property at this time. Why, in fact, why does there even have to be such a thing? Given that there's you and the property and the time, why does there have to be such a thing as the acquisition by you of that property at that time? Why do we need that?
If you don't like events, just ignore it. I mean, I was just quoting our paper, and we had kind of built in, we just.
Well,
we made a
decision.
decision. No, I'm completely neutral about whether causation involves events or property instantiations or property types.
Causally efficacious.
Yeah, whatever it is. I usually call it a feature.
What is it?
It's a mental feature. And then you can fill in
well, the features of property, right?
It could be a property, it could be an event, it could be a state, it could be a process.
Well, a process is an event. We're back to events.
No, just choose your favorite.
But my favorite.
He doesn't have any feeling, that's the point.
Here's
Oh, he's a
here's a
Platonist.
causal relation.
Well,
The
you got
Earth,
it, you have
the Earth
harmony
attracts the
example.
moon. Is this one thing with a mass and it pulls on this other thing. But I don't see that I need anything except substances and abstract objects in my ontology, and I don't see how that fits into your picture of
Yeah.
causal efforts.
Good. Look, you as a Platonist or somebody who's a nominalist who rejects any kind of property-like goings on as token instantiated, then, you know, you have your usual stories to tell, don't you? Right?
Well,
Like a nominalist will have a story to tell about how it could be that this cup is,
Well, yeah,
cup shaped.
I've never understood the nominalist story. They say they understood.
Yeah, good. So, look,
She's saying your nominalism about events. You would translate event talk into
Yeah.
your preferred ontology.
that's
She's
fine.
inviting you to
I
do
invite
that.
you to make any translations that you want
But
or
there,
need.
but you never get anything metal being efficacious in my translation. It's only atoms, only atoms
that's-
and elementary particles are causally efficacious.
What if it's strong emergence?
Well, I don't
Right.
understand that.
Well, I tried to
Yeah, I
explain
know
it,
you
but maybe you
did.
should read my book.
That's the content.
I think we're gonna
Okay,
discuss
never mind.
emergence more. So, okay, so it's Diego. you must do the next one.
Oh, yeah, this is like sort of a clarificatory question. So, like, I have to admit, I actually like sort of don't understand this talk of emergence and sort of do, but so like people who, and it's just a curiosity really, like people who think that there's like strong emergence, for example, at the level of the mind, like you and Tim, like, do you also think that there's like strong emergence, for example, at many levels between like atoms at the mind, or just at the mind, or something like, or you just like don't you're neutral with respect to that, but
Yeah.
like you wouldn't deny that someone say like, no, there's actually like
Yeah.
strong emergence, like at many other levels.
Yeah.
So-
I think it's an empirical question.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a
okay,
very
okay,
nice
okay.
question. And for most of the cases that I consider in the book, so complex systems,
Right.
ordinary objects, consciousness or conscious mental states, non-free ones, and then free will, I argue that there's plenty of weak emergence, but the case for strong emergence has not yet been made. So interestingly, I think free will, libertarian free will, constitutes the really the best case for there being strong emergence. So there I differ from Chalmers. I don't think that the cases that he's offered for taking qualitative mental states to be strongly emergent actually go through. So I talk about that in my book as well. But the distinctive thing about libertarian free will is that it is nomologically transcendent, at least as I'm understanding it. So, you know, it really is, I think, the best case we've got for a strongly emergent phenomenon. However, these other cases that have sometimes been suggested to be strongly emergent, for example, qualitative mental states, or some even suggest that there might be some strong emergence going on at even lower physical levels. There, I think that would be an empirical question. It's an open empirical question. We don't currently have much reason to think that there's strong emergence, but ultimately the possibility there is not one that we could determine a priori, I don't think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I have a finger on that, like real quick? Right. So like, so there are some people, for example, that think like, oh yeah, there's emergence at their level or whatever. So I take, for example, some of those people to think that we will never have like a fundamental physical theory of everything, or something, right? So it has like this like position about strong emergence implies like that we won't have the theory. Or there are some people who think that, oh, we will have a theory of everything, but it will include, for example, the mind. So there's like, it's a position about what like physical theories do or whatever. So our final physical theory, I think Philip Goff thinks this, right? Our final physical theory would just like be physical, and then a little bit of the mind or something. And there's this other position, which is like, no, I mean, we will never have a final physical theory, not even one that includes biology, not even one that includes like less complicated things than the mind. So we don't even have a reason to like think it. So like, I don't know if I guess I don't know if the free will people are like from that camp, just like I don't have any reason to like, so we just forget about the physics, forget about physics being like that fundamental, or they're like, or I guess some of them will be like, we will have a final theory, but it will include sort of like this free will stuff, you know?
At the particles, remember values?
Yeah. Yeah, free will particles.
Yeah.
Look, there's a question here about how to understand physical theory. I don't think the right way to understand physical theory is like as a theory of everything. I know Chomsky suggests something like that, but my published my published view, which I'm going to stick by for present purposes, is that what's characteristic of physics or physical entities has to do with like the comparatively non-complex goings on that are the proper subset, target of investigation by the physicist, basically. But biological goings on and so on, I don't see those as subsumable into physics itself. I mean, it stands in various relations. If your question is whether attention to emergence will, especially if there is any strong emergence, will that mean, until we know whether these phenomena are strongly emergent, we won't know whether we have a complete fundamental theory or not? I think the answer is yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I think Janan and then John.
John is going first and I'm going after.
Okay, John.
I'm going first because Suzanne told me to. Okay, so I'm a naturalist and identity theorist for that matter.
Yeah.
I'm a naturalist. What I mean is that human beings and other animals and things that we think have minds, and as a matter of fact, everything that I'll ever operates according to the laws of nature that explain lower animals and dirt and falling bricks and all that stuff. That's vague, but it probably relates to the idea.
Gotcha.
I certainly did not mean materialism, because I think materialism
What is an antecedent physicalist?
Huh?
You're an antecedent physicalist.
Yeah, I used to be. I guess I still
Yeah.
am. Post Anderson. All right, so you got dominoes. You got 15 dominoes lined up right there. So, you know what dominoes are? Not pizzas. But playing time. And I hit this one. And by hitting that one caused it to fall, it caused the next one fall, caused the next one fall, caused the next one, so forth, until the last one fall.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I think that, the laws of nature and facts up till then, whether it's determinism or, some fairly well-behaved indeterminism. When I hit the first one, the laws of nature, in addition to the way they're arranged, determine or settle the issue of what the last domino is going to call.
Sounds good.
Does that mean that the second to the last domino falling is not causally efficacious? Of course it does. Right? I mean, the last domino would not have fallen if I removed the second to last domino. So, now, okay, so having played dominoes for a couple of years, I started to study philosophy.
somebody says, well, you're not free. Well, you know, I mean, you're part, if you think as you seem to do, you're part of the physical world, and you're not free because the physical world is deterministic or nearly so, and that means that everything you do, every muscle you move, it's really in effect the things that happen long ago. And once the since settled 10 years ago, well, I'm older than 100 years ago. I don't know. If it was determined 100 years ago, well, I was just like in the hands of almost determined 100 years ago. Yeah, regular indeterminate. That I would drink the water.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that what happened 100 years ago caused me to drink it in any simple. You know, it was what called Ines condition. All the causes are Ines conditions. It's misleading to call them causes and tell them what you're thinking the cause is called. So my point is, so somebody tells me, I think, what do you mean? I think I do things freely because, you know, there's things I do that I think over carefully, weigh the balance, you know, good or bad. I think about what other people would think. You know, I wait till after I read my Bible to for the day to the final decision. Ask my sister. You know, everything I can to deliberate and make a good decision, and then I do it. And that's what I think of as being free.
Yeah.
And being responsible for what I do. Why was the fact that it was determined or almost determined? Dealing with causal succession is put in order 100 years ago to me. Why does that in any way show that I didn't do what I did? And the doing that I did wasn't of a special kind that I was aware of because I was doing it. It involved introspection and thinking, reading the Bible, and reading Wittgenstein, you know, reading Peter, and all sorts of things that people do to make their decisions. Why would anyone think that? Naturalism and determinism in any way. Of course, you might say, well, didn't you believe it for years? Well, yeah, of course. Ask me now. Why? I don't see the reason.
Well, what you just described sounded a lot to me like a, you know, a standard compatibilist strategy. You know, you're talking about, you deliberated, you thought about this.
Yeah, but
So you're not just randomly.
You were trying to put forward why a compatible seems to have a problem.
Look,
And
I
it
was
seems
just
to be
saying,
driven to something
not-
called,
yeah.
I don't know, extra law-like something.
Yeah.
And I don't see what it is.
well, you know, you're sitting 2 doors down from somebody who has said that it is a problem and it's gotten a lot of press. So I'm helping myself, I'm piggybacking on that kind of problematic and saying, okay, here's a problematic. People have thought it worth responding to. You've got a story according to which it's not a problem. That's
No, I don't
fine.
have a story. I'm just imagining, not having
Yeah.
a story, not having thought about it at all.
Well, you gave a talk
And
about it.
That's not what I'm imagining. And then having you or Peter or myself 20 years ago explain why if you're a naturalist and a determinist, you're not free.
Yeah.
Being utterly puzzled. Right. So that mean I shouldn't write the book that I spent 3 years on?
Absolutely not.
Now, due to our clever way of doing this.
Yeah.
If I've said anything true,
What?
she will.
She will. But again, I think what you just said is not too far removed from what compatibilists like to say. Those compatibilists who think they want to try to get a response to this supposed problematic. So, you know, you and the people who think there is a genuine problematic have arrived at the same place, although I guess you got there a lot more quickly.
He said more time.
Right, okay. Janelle.
Okay, yeah, very quickly.
Louder.
The question is,
Okay.
so you say, and you lean really heavily on this idea that we experience, or you think that the strongly emergent person should lean heavily on this idea that we experience ourselves as seeming to freely choose in ways transcending any nomological deterministic terms.
Yeah.
Does the bird flying experience itself as flying in ways transcending any nomological goings on? Or when I walk down the street, I experience myself as walking in ways that transcend. And I'm asking this in all
Yeah.
honesty, like
Yeah.
what's the alternative
Yeah.
phenomenology?
Yeah.
Surely you don't mean that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't feel the law is pushing me or anything. So
Yeah,
I genuinely want to understand what this phenomenology is.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I do want to contrast, the choosing with those sorts of cases. So I just look at it, this paradigm case. I'm gonna drop the pen or not. Nothing is forcing me, it's like,
Really hard. So what would the alternative be like? What would it be like if I focused really hard and I
well,
said, oh gosh, I
Yeah.
really don't
Yeah.
feel myself
uh-huh.
choosing in a way that transcends any nomological ones. In fact, I feel the